Okay, that's great. All right. Well, look, Larry, David, absolutely delighted that you're back. You've become a bit of a feature for us in the last couple of years. Um, this is the book. This is what we're here all to discuss today. Can I have a quick show of hands? Unfortunately, this only landed in the UK a week ago. So I've had to race through it. Pete Mellor was just saying that he's had to read it as well very quickly. Who's actually read the book this week? Who's ordered it and read it? Robert's read it in the States. Peter,
I've read
I've
it.
read
Nancy's
I've read
read it.
sections of it.
Scott, you've read sections of it. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of people on the call
I've
here.
read it.
Sorry, Johnny. Yes, I thought you might have read it, Johnny. I might ask you for your thoughts at some point.
Yeah, but he didn't even have to buy his copy. We sent it to him.
Oh, typical Scotsman cheapskate, huh? So, yeah, I mean, I've read it this week very, very quickly, guys. I haven't had a chance to delve deep into all the footnotes as you would expect, and it's the kind of book that you definitely have to go back and read again, which is always the case, as you know. My personal view, having raced through it this week, is that it is very interesting. It is very fresh in terms of the perspective. But to be fair to DP UK members, we knew what was coming, Larry. I mean, you know, we had the Redbird thing, I don't know, 3 years ago, whenever that was, and in the last 18 months, you know, you've done the trilogy with or without David. So, you know, we knew exactly the kind of the way this was going to pan out. So that there's sort of no surprise there. I think you actually have pulled a lot of strings together, which is, you know, really interesting. And, you know, from my perspective as a reader, and obviously not as an author, I see continuity and consistency in what you've written and how your thought process has gathered. And I particularly found the biographical components really interesting, actually. And to me, it's kind of what you've said before when we've been on Zoom calls. This whole sort of wash, rinse, dry, repeat cycle that has occurred throughout his young life, wherever he's been. The only two chapters that I found a bit difficult was the one on CIA compartmentalization, you know, and also the DRE backstory. And I think that's because that's just not my area of research. I mean, someone like Pete Mellor has done, you know, work on that kind of stuff. But, you know, John Newman, Malcolm Blunt, Jeff Morley, those guys, you know, they're easy chapters for them to understand. But I'm not into CIA spycraft, and you can get lost in, you know, the cryptonyms as well. So they're the only two chapters that I struggled a little bit on, and obviously would go back and read those. But I mean, my summary as a reader, and obviously, you know, you guys will be commenting on this at some point. What we've got here is a left-leaning, strong-minded, arrogant, relatively social character, which is obviously, you know, the antithesis of the Warren Commission portrayal, who doesn't like bureaucracy, doesn't particularly like authority. And, you know, at certain points in his life, he loses interest and he gets bored and he resets. And he has setbacks, but he kind of overcomes them with this kind of resetting process. And then obviously the ultimate, you know, conclusion, which will be discussed, of course, today, is that, you know, he is not a witting CIA agent, and he has been, you know, manipulated ultimately to be framed and set up as a patsy by either real CIA or rogue CIA, or those guys in combination with a group of exile anti-Castro Cubans. That's my sort of 2-minute summary on how I see the book. Do you want to quickly comment on that? Have I got any of that wrong? Or would you like to elaborate on that, guys?
No, from my perspective, actually, I think I recognize a lot of Oswald in people that I was in college with in 1968. The description could be very familiar. They were anti-establishment. They weren't satisfied with the establishment. They wanted something different. They wanted something better. If you agreed with them and talked to them, it could be a great conversation. If you didn't, it would be a very brief conversation or not one at all. You would find them out protesting in front of the student union on microphones. They wanted public visibility for their opinion. When George de Mohrenschildt says he viewed Oswald as later as kind of a proto-hippie, and in a way I recognize that, maybe not so much on the hippie side as the anti-war side, for example. Oswald certainly would have been out there in the street on that. So I think, Neil, your characterization, and we've got to say, and I think David can chime in, our focus on this book was really the biographical part. I mean, that's what we wanted to be very strict about, as little speculation as possible, kind of give him an objective biography for a change, since he certainly didn't get one from the Warren Commission, and since, generally speaking, when he's been written about by myself and others, it's been in a certain context. It wasn't a broad view of his personality. Tidovitz might be the only one who tried to give a broader view of his personality. So yeah, I would agree with that. What we have in the third part of the book about who he was entangled by, who he was manipulated by, is speculative, and we like to be very clear about that. We're moving on, trying to maybe make it a little less speculative in the future, connecting some more dots, but it is, and there are lots of open questions about that. I don't think either David and I would claim for a minute that we know exactly what happened with Lee Oswald after he left New Orleans. David, you want to chime in with that kind of comment?
Yeah, I mean, this book it's not finished yet. It's at a point in time, our thoughts, now with all the new docs coming out, we're trying to put some more pieces together, whether, reinforces or takes away from what we wrote. We're trying to be honest what was going on. So we are making some progress as to the New Orleans crew, which we'll probably discuss later here, like trying to firm up some connections there and actually point out exactly how Oswald was surveilled and how he was manipulated. So that's one of the major focuses we're working on now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is fair to say that, I mean, there's a big chunk that is biographical, but you do, I mean, you do speculate. Sorry, what's happening here? You do speculate, but you do make it very clear that you are speculating. I mean, that word must have come up a dozen times in the book when you specifically refer. So, in terms of how this is going to go today, I'm going to ask a few questions just to start with, just to kick off. And there's a healthy audience here today in terms of numbers, and then the floor can come in either via the chat function. So Scott, please look up, if you could have a look at the chat function to see if any questions are raised there, or just just put your hand up and we can go directly to you at some point. But just in terms of the sort of the bigger picture questions, what and again, because I mean, obviously, the DP UK members, we've had quite a lot of dialogue with you in the last couple of years, but there might be people that have been living under a rock. And of course, this is uploaded to YouTube. So, we have to bear in mind that there are people that aren't as necessarily as hardcore as us. Can you just refresh what made you, what prompted your reset? Because obviously, for a considerable period of time, 2.5 decades possibly, you were very much in line with the Kennedy Association Research Community Lore, LORE, if you like. Why did you go back and look at Oswald? Did you kind of think it was a long time coming and something you hadn't done properly before, or was there a catalyst? I mean, did it come from documents that sort of spurred you to think, hang on a second, we need to go back and start from scratch here.
Yeah, and I'll have to take responsibility for that since I kind of drew David in, like it was my thought that I had written things about Oswald. Periodically I look back at Someone Would Have Talked, which I mean came out in 3 editions. So obviously over time I'd even changed my mind or added to my thoughts about that. I look back and really said that I saw that I had made some very generic statements about Oswald where I was just repeating other people. It really wasn't my research. I was taking for granted. I mean, after 30 years at this, when I started, I just did kind of like extract information and pull it together. So I was repeating things that as if I knew they were true, that when I looked at them again, it's like, do I really know that for sure, considering what I've learned more recently, especially considering what we've seen in the last decade or so, And I think in the interim, I'd also had a chance to talk at length with a couple of Marine friends of mine, including Jack Swike, who served in counterintelligence in Japan and investigated Oswald quite deeply from his perspective of military intelligence, his knowledge of being at Atsugi and what went on there. And he had gone back and interviewed lots of Marines. Interestingly, he interviewed lots of Marines, and after talking to them, went to look for their testimony in the Warren Commission and was actually referred to, it wasn't there. And he was referred to where it was supposed to be, and when he went there, it wasn't there either. So he was bringing in some new perspective. Ernst Tudowitz's work on Oswald really had brought in a lot of new perspective to me as Oswald as an individual, Oswald as a character, personality, pros, cons, etc. So I had a chance to talk with some people and actually even on the military side do some more work on military intelligence. The first book, Someone Would Have Talked, came before Shadow Warfare and Surprise Attack and In Denial, and before I really had kind of taught myself about some of those areas. So I had to go back and go, wait a minute, what did I learn that is now relevant? So that's a lot of the reason for the reset, and just kind of saying to myself, somebody needs to step back and take this fresh and don't get stuck in the ruts on either of the ruts. Now obviously that's not going to be easy. If you step out of both ruts, where are you? You're in a trail not traveled, right? So things are going to be rougher. That's why there are ruts. But that's the honest answer. And I pulled David into it in some of the areas in particular that we had been working on, as you say, in regard to Redbird, and a connection that had been brought up and developed. I mean, the Redbird thing developed over 30 years. It was researched in the UK first. It came out of the UK and then came to the US.
Matt Smith was behind it, wasn't he?
Oh yeah. Matthew did all the work with January, and then there were whole iterations of turning up new information about the, validating January as a source, etc. So long-winded answer to your question, it's kind of like, okay, let's start again and see what makes sense about Oswald with what we know now, and does that correlate with things like the Redbird incident? Can we find some corroboration? And that's especially when I pulled David in and we got deeply into the DRE elements. Can you corroborate Ray January by finding a male and female from DRE in Dallas at that point in time that could fit those people? Turns out you can. We had no idea about that when Matthew was originally writing. It's just we were able to go somewhere he could not go. So that's why the reset, and that's why the book took, in itself, covering material that had been covered before, took a couple of years, including, of course, Rex Bradford's contribution, who literally forced us to deal with things that we probably would have avoided otherwise. Rex is a great editor. Have to blame lots of things on Rex. Right, David?
This book wouldn't exist in its form without Rex. Rex tremendous editor, smart guy, and he
And
pushed
critic.
us, huh?
And critic, ongoing.
And a
It's
critic.
like,
Oh, great
can you
critic.
guys really say that? How can you even say that? I
You
don't,
know,
I don't know that. Convince me.
then he came and said, "What about Mexico City?" Oh boy, there goes the swamp. So
Mm. Well, thank you for that first answer, Larry. I mean, you kind of touched on it, but it was going to be a segue into my second question is, in the last few years, since you were going through your own reset process, if you like, have you had any verbal or written communication with Marina, Titsovitz, Ruth Payne, Buell Wesley Frazier, Paul Gregory, say, the Marines that knew Oswald? Have you been able to get any additional validation through telephone calls or meetings or email or whatever? Because obviously you're taking a deep dive into Oswald's DNA and character and motivation and what makes him tick. I mean, if you can get some first, primary source stuff, that helps.
Well, two things. First, yeah, I've corresponded with Ernst, with Titsovitz. As a matter of fact, we sent him a review copy of the book. So I have been in touch with him and people that have worked with him also.
Mhm.
So I've been in touch with him. As I said, the Marines. I've been in touch with other people that have worked the Oswald thing over the years, but I'll be frank. At this point in time, I am very adverse to witnesses and witness remarks coming out decades after the fact. Yeah, Buell Wesley Frazier, yes, I've talked to him at length. I've talked to him at length multiple times. I've been with him in Dallas when he's made presentations. I've seen disconnects in his story. There is absolutely no doubt that his story has changed and his story has become different over time. So I'm one of those people. I tend now probably much more than I did early on. If I see something that you said during the first 24 hours, the first 48 hours, something that you said under oath or in testimony early on, and I can corroborate it, I'm good. But if you come back 30 years later, talking to Marina right now, after she has worked with so many researchers, with Mary Farrell, with Deborah, yeah, I honestly didn't even consider going back and talking to Marina. So I didn't go backward to that extent to your question, this because I am now extremely nervous, more because of work I did on other cases like MLK and RFK about memory and memory issues and memory overlays. Anybody that started talking to researchers, now I worry about, because all the scientific studies show that they're easily overwritten. So yes and no.
All right. So another question that I've got is what you elected not to discuss in the book, and what were the possible reasons for not discussing certain aspects of this saga, whether you thought it wasn't relevant or whether you thought it didn't fit in, or what is the motivation. And the things that sprung to mind for me after this first read was obviously how did he get to the Soviet Union, the whole Helsinki saga. There's David Ferry is mentioned in one sentence. You don't go into the shore ferry banister milieu, for want of a better expression. You haven't touched on Judy Baker. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but she's inserted into this story, obviously in New Orleans.
That's an easy one to answer, but we won't go there.
You don't talk about how he gets to Mexico, which we know is very problematic as well, and you don't really talk about how he gets the TSBD job either. So these are the things that sort of struck me that you chose not to tackle. What are the reasons for that?
Two things. First of all, we wanted this book to focus on what we'd learned and what was new. Almost everything that you mentioned there is been written about over and over and over again, and we don't really have anything to add to that story. You know, as far as Helsinki, one new thing I thought that was interesting in the documents that were released this week, we saw an interesting CIA document, internal CIA document, showing that the CIA was very concerned about things like, how did Oswald really get into Russia, Helsinki? What's going on with Helsinki? We don't understand Helsinki. Why did he go there? How did he bring back a Russian wife? You know, it's like the CIA itself is puzzled by Oswald's entry and exit from Russia. If the CIA is puzzled, that kind of speaks to the fact that he wasn't being facilitated and put into the CIA, or they would know about it, or, oh, of course, somebody that knows about it wasn't talking to it. But officially, they're concerned. They're actually concerned internally that we should look into this, because maybe the Russians had, maybe the Russians had already made a deal with him. Maybe they brought him in. Maybe he was working for the Russians. Of course, another release quite clearly shows that from the KGB files, there's no sign of that, which Ernst had already made quite clear, that in all his work in getting KGB files and going through them, he saw, yeah, they had Oswald under surveillance. They were bugging his apartment. It was constantly watched, but was never even considered as a viable information source, which you kind of knew because they didn't put him in front of the media. Like, he's the only American that purportedly defects and speaks badly about the U.S. that doesn't go in front of Pravda. Who does he go through? And the State Department puts him in front of American reporters, not the Soviets putting in front of Soviet media. Okay, so that's on the Helsinki. Nothing really to add. We've seen nothing that we didn't at least mention in the book. There is certainly a possibility that Oswald offered information in Helsinki that eased his way in. We think there's possible that he offered information to the State Department coming back that eased his way back. And that he was upset about that as he rode on the boat. But so that's Helsinki. Okay, as far as David and I both knew, it's kind of like, okay, how early on are they going to ask about David Ferry? Okay, I mean, I'm like, okay,
Well,
is
I
that
gave
the
it
first
20 I gave
question,
it
the
20
third
minutes.
question? Again, the honest answer to that is we have nothing new to add. Everybody that's written about the Bannister, Ferry, Shaw connections has written about it. That wasn't the area in New Orleans that we chose to pursue. We think the new things that we pursued are the exile CIA connections from Quiraga, Ernesto Rodriguez, Emilio Rodriguez, people that are directly tied into the CIA operationally, that are doing counterintelligence, that are doing political action, that are doing propaganda. You can say what you want about Shaw and Ferry and Bannister, but that's not what they're doing. If Oswald came in contact with them in 1963, I'm not going to deny that happened. We just don't see it as operationally important to the story that we're following with the CIA officers and the Cuban exiles. We see that story as developing in a very concrete fashion. So why repeat anything that's already been written? And bottom line is, we refer you to Jim Garrison's investigation in his book. If you haven't been familiar with that, go look at it. David, you want to expand on that one?
Oh, that's exactly it. We haven't found anything new on Bannister, Ferry, Shaw. I mean, it's been written. Jim D did a great job in his book. Garrison did a great job in his book. Everything that's come out since hasn't really built on that story. I mean, we're looking for it, but we didn't see it.
I mean,
the only thing that I found interesting was, thanks to Bart and Malcolm, they sent me a document on Ernesto Rodriguez. And Ernesto Rodriguez, it was an interview we had in 1980. A little background on Ernesto Rodriguez was with the CRC, Cuban Revolutionary Council in New Orleans. And he also worked out of that office at 544 Camp Street in 62. So he says, yeah, he admitted, said, yeah, I knew Bannister and all those guys, so there's a connection there. That was kind of new to me that Ernesto Rodriguez actually admitted that, yeah, I knew Bannister and all those guys. He never said who all the other guys were. So I thought that was interesting.
And he knew Oswald was in touch with Ernesto's father, Barthez, all these people in New Orleans. They had keys to the building. Okay, they had keys to Bannister's building. It's not like you can't make a connection to the building. Making a connection to something operational is another story. And we felt the much more important story was entangling Oswald with CIA operations via the DRE, via SAS. That's a direct picture of Oswald being entangled with operations going on in 1963 that you don't have to speculate about. It's provable. And that's the story we chose to follow, which was a new story. Let's see, you said.
But just going back to
ahead.
that, I mean, a lot of this is about his character, his motivation, his DNA, his ideology. Could you just give us, a sense? I mean, why would he be knocking around with the Ferry Shaw's Bannister type of characters, given that they were so diametrically opposed politically and ideologically? And going back to the other point that you made with the anti-Castro Cubans, what is the motivation to reach out to those characters, offering, as an ex-Marine, offering to help train, etc., for the cause? What could you focus on that, guys?
That I think was really clear. The first of all, Oswald's, which we try to give the picture in the book. It's hard to give the picture quickly. Oswald was interested in two things that spring and that summer. He was anti-fascist, as we see in Dallas. So if you look at his notebook, you see he's not, you see addresses of Walker, different, people like Bannister, let's say. I mean, Bannister was far more fascist than Shaw or Ferry. You might actually even consider, other than the anti-communist links, Shaw was known to be, let's face it, among the cultured, more liberal circles in New Orleans. But Bannister was clearly a racist and a fascist, if you will, working for the anti-integration forces and so on and so forth. But Oswald was interested in them. I mean, he was interested in opposing them. As de Mohrenschildt said, Oswald wanted to do something that would oppose fascist and racist. And he'd already done that in Dallas. So the fact that he wouldn't necessarily, if he happened to meet Ferry again or Shaw again, or they wanted to have a contact with him, that doesn't mean that he's going to reject them. Oswald's just going to follow his own agenda. That doesn't mean he's supporting their agenda, kind of as with Bringuier. The first thing he does when he gets, not the first thing, once he gets bored with his job in New Orleans, because that's always critical, and it gets back into his activism, because you've got to separate Oswald's family, job, routine day from when he gets bored and becomes Oswald the activist again. Why would he approach the Cubans? Because he was interested in opposing the Cubans in support of the FPCC, in support of his own agenda. He had been leafleting for Castro. He wanted to know who the enemy was, quite frankly. So what does he do? He gets close to them, as he had in Dallas with Walker. In New Orleans, he reaches out to the Cubans. And David can go through the story in more detail than I, but he reaches out to Ernesto, the junior at the language school, and connects in all the way to Bringuier. So Oswald is interested in opposing these people, so he's got to know who they are. And quite frankly, we don't say so in the book, but the fact that he would choose to do that for a couple of weeks, let him know who he, what he is, who they were. They begin to investigate him. And then he goes public with his pro-Castro support, blocks away from where he knows they are, he knows they're going to show up. There is no doubt in my mind that he knew that they were going to show up. And when Bringier shows up, he is, okay, go ahead and hit me. He's ready for this. This is street agitation. When Oswald gets to Mexico City, one of his credentials that he gives to the Cubans is, I'm a Cuban street agitator. I know how to do this stuff. I'm a street level fighter. So that's why there's no problem with him being associated with right wingers in New Orleans or reaching out. It's Oswald's agenda. You got to overlay his agenda on events, not reverse engineer events to his agenda. David, want to talk about the Cubans again?
Yeah, I mean, when Oswald decided to reach out to the Cubans, who did he go see first? He went to go see Ernesto Rodriguez at his school, the Berlitz School of Modern Languages. He approached Ernesto and said, I want to learn how to speak Spanish. That's why I went to go see him. And then, that quite a conversation. Then Oswald started to show off, started to speak Russian to Ernesto. Ernesto himself said, no, he said, I tried talking Russian with him, but I couldn't keep up because his Russian was so much better than mine. But Ernesto did give him some addresses of local Cubans to go see and talk to, because at this time I don't think Oswald's saying, hey, I want to go to Cuba, I'm a pro-Castro, everything was still up in the air at that time. So Ernesto gave him Carlos Bringier's address, because Ernesto Rodriguez and Carlos Bringier were really close, both been members of the same group. They would go to John Birch Society meetings together. These both were FBI informants. These guys hung out. They were close. So, and if you look at Oswald's notebook, he's got the various addresses of local Cubans in there, including Carlos Bringier's. So that was, one of his entrances to the Cuban, anti-Castro Cuban groups was through Ernesto Rodriguez.
And one of the things we're learning from the new documents, which again is going to become very interesting, one of the things we now know is that virtually all the Cubans he encountered were either FBI or CIA sources or both, okay? But the interesting thing is when you dig into the details and find out the reporting that they're doing, and by the way, there even seems to be like Augustine Guittard, I don't pronounce it correctly, Guittard.
Yeah.
I wish I had mastered Spanish. I failed that twice in college. I was part of a spotter network that had been set up to detect basically infiltrators, Cuban agents or pro-Cuban people that were showing up in New Orleans and report on them. The interesting thing is that we have more views into that network. They'd actually even set up using Sylvia Odio's uncle as a cover. They had set up a young woman as an agent, as a mail drop cutout that was going to be used as part of this spotter network. And that is, we now think that's one of the reasons why this group of Cubans, anti-Castro Cubans, reacted so quickly to send Quiroga to test out Oswald to see which side he was really on, because one of their roles was to detect, who's anti-Castro, who's pro-Castro. We're going to report on them. The interesting thing is, even though they were signed up to report on that to the FBI, they don't do it. They keep all this information internal within the DRE or within themselves, and manage that information themselves. That didn't really come out until we started looking at Oswald's interaction with the FBI and who he was reporting on. And that took us back to kind of like, we know these Cubans that were in contact with him and suspicious of him, but they didn't report him to the FBI. They reported him to the DRE and the CIA. That becomes very interesting. But so in any event, that's the trail we followed, which we think is a new trail rather than going back to everything that had been written before that we don't know any more about.
So how do we get from the anti-Castro exiles looking at Oswald from a propaganda perspective, and the value in that, to this setting him up as a patsy. That's quite a big leap, isn't it? And when did that happen?
That's the next book. Like I said, we
Okay.
told you we weren't done yet. I mean, the question is, and it's a big question. David and I are still working on defining the question. This is very complex, for heaven's sakes, because what you've got is you've got things going on that are very much sanctioned by the CIA. Propaganda is sanctioned by the CIA. The DRE is doing that. The CIA is doing that, and may do more of it with Oswald. And the people that we think were directly involved with Oswald from New Orleans on, and in the book, we're pretty clear that we think that's Carlos Hernandez, Victor Hernandez, some of these other guys who have a very unusual set of a career in 1963. At one point in time, they're working with the DRE, and then the DRE gets cut off from all military activities. These guys get let go from the CIA operations they were on, and they're freelancers. And they're maybe getting some money still from a little through the DRE, but they're freelancers, and they're beginning to go work with other groups. Carlos goes to work with guys that are affiliated with Jure, okay, which we all have thought was opposed, but they're freelancers. And then what happens? After Oswald leaves New Orleans, end of August, early September, by late September, our friend Carlos is recruited for the AmWorld project. So the big question is, during the time when we think he was traveling with Oswald to Dallas and possibly to Mexico, who was he really taking orders with? Is it DRE? Is it he's now working for AmWorld and they're paying but they're not going to do anything with him or Izquierdo or Felix Rodriguez until they exfiltrate them out of the country. So these guys are totally off the board. There appears to be no one in charge of them. So did they get recruited into this clique Garrett Underhill talks about? I think they did. But how that happened and how it happened month by week and month by month and week by week, and how Oswald at some point in time turned into from something interesting and of potential value to something that was actually usable in Dallas is another story. We've always thought that they might have considered using him for something in other locations like Washington, D.C., because of Oswald's strange interest in going to Washington for no obvious reason in September timeframe. So we don't know. We're going to work on that, but I'm always inclined to say what I don't know and what I'm not willing to accept any longer, that I might have been able to just, okay, I accept that because somebody else said it's true. I've gone past that.
Okay. So something I thought was enlightening was the Sylvia Odio bit that you put in the book, and Espinosa and Hernandez being the protagonists. Historically, I think I'd read it was Lauren Hall and perhaps Lawrence Howard that were Leopoldo and Angelo. How confident are you that it's these two guys, and the Lauren Hall Lawrence Howard thing is nonsense, for example?
Well, since you gave me that intro, I'll do that and hand it over to David. But even the FBI knew it wasn't Howard and those guys. I wrote about that, and someone would have talked. Hoover went back to the Warren Commission, who had asked it be reinvestigated, and Hoover wrote the Warren Commission that, yeah, we've looked into it, and now we know it's these three guys. I found the internal memo and wrote about it, that internally within the FBI, they go, no, it wasn't these three guys because we found that they were in Florida, etc. There's an internal memo that says we investigated it and no, it's not them. And they agree that it's not them. Hoover chose to ignore that and reassure the Warren Commission. So not them, in my view, and I'd have to go back to the book a long time ago for the details on that. But I did tackle that like a couple of decades ago.
Okay.
But this is David's area of expertise. I'll let him give him confidence. I'm behind you all the way, David. And by the way, Neil, you said this in your message. I want everyone to know that I have started out with Diet Dr. Pepper, but as soon as I see somebody on this call pick up a beer, I am prepared to change.
Well, prepare yourself to change, because at
Okay.
some point we will have a refreshment break, and I'm sure someone's going to crack open a beer. In fact, David Ward is already on one.
Way ahead of us.
All right. So, David, you're just going to delve a bit deeper into those two characters and Sylvia Odio, yeah?
So are we 100% sure it was these two guys? No. I mean, can you change my mind with some additional information, data? Yes. But this kind of evolved over a couple of years looking at these guys. I focus on Carlos Hernandez quite a bit because he keeps popping up in all these situations. He was with the DRE. He went over to Helsinki. He was part of a psychological warfare agitation group over there, which was with Juan Soldat and Anita Diaz Silveira, who coincidentally appears in Dallas in October, giving speeches trying to raise funds for the DRE. And he was on stage with them in Helsinki in '62. So come October, there's this guy unnamed who happens to be a black belt that he actually said, given a speech on stage in October. So it's kind of like, how many Cuban black belts are there that knows Juan Soldat and Anita Diaz Silveira for the DRE and was on stage with them? Well, previously that would be Carlos Hernandez. Hernandez had a black belt in judo. He was also Manuel Adame's bodyguard in 1960. He was close to Adame, who was, eventually running AmWorld, the whole project. So, I focused on him quite a bit. And of course, he shows up. He's in New Orleans during the summer of '63. Who's he with? He's with one of his best friends. He said, the best friend I met in the camps when he's training for the Bay of Pigs invasion in '61 was Victor Espinosa Hernandez. See, it's my best friend. Essentially we hung together back in preparing for the Bay of Pigs, and we actually infiltrated into Cuba prior to the Bay of Pigs. They were considered commandos. These guys were going to do some nasty work before the invasion. So they went a couple times to Cuba. So, these guys are very interesting, highly trained, worked with the CIA, was trained by Rip Robertson, Carl Jenkins. Those are the guys, they trained and knew with. So he was, he went from the MRR. This is just a little background, and goes for the, joined the DRE. Interesting, in the summer of '63, he put in with Carlos Zaraga. It's probably a new name for a lot of people. Carlos Zaraga was the head of Cuba Libre, which was under the umbrella of Jure. So essentially, he was a member of, the Jure, Jure, which was Sylvia Odio's group. So Carlos Zaraga was a longtime CIA asset. FBI informant. There's quite a bit of information if you look at Mary Farrell on Carlos Zaraga. So Zaraga also supplied weapons to Jure and other people. He was in Miami. He was considered the Jackie Gleason of the Cuban exiles, if you will. Same build and everything, glasses, kind of short and stocky. So as we focus more on Hernandez, we find that he was, in September 18th, '63, he was given his POA, provisional operational approval, by the CIA to be a commando, because he was so highly trained, and become a member of the AmWorld team. He was close to Adame and Rafael Quintero. Chichi Quintero was a big name as far as, in the Cuban community. As far as Espinosa was close to Frank Barthez. Who is Frank Barthez? I've read the book a little bit. Barthez was the head of the New Orleans CRC. The history of the CRC in New Orleans, you go from Sergio Cacha Smith, who Ernesto Rodriguez helped kick out, and they put Louis Rebel as the head of the CRC in New Orleans. And he left, due to personal reasons. And who took his place was Frank Barthez. Head of New Orleans CRC, Barthez, who's he close to? Victor Espinosa. Espinosa and Barthez are in Miami together in June of, end of June in 63. They're at the house together. Victor's brother, Rene, also was close to Barthez. If you heard the reports in New Orleans of this big Mexican guy, very muscular, that could possibly be Rene, because he would have been visiting Bartez's daughter, who he was interested in at the time. So when you look at Espinosa and you look at Carlos and Victor, I started digging into what Sylvia Odio had to say about her visitors. They were Mexican looking, but Cubans. So we don't have great pictures of these two guys, but the physical characteristics matched them exactly. Leopoldo would be Victor. She said he was around 6 feet, 170 pounds, Mexican looking. And if you look at his description, Victor was 5'11", 170 pounds, very Mexican looking. The FBI, when he was questioned after the Lake Pontchartrain raid, July 30th, 63, you see that they describe him as Indian looking, so there's that, and they have a picture there. You look, he's tall, he's thin. And when he filled out his CIA report, personnel report back in 1960, before he got hired for the Bay of Pigs, they said occupation, and this guy, he's got quite a sense of humor. He said student/playboy. He considered himself quite the player, and big flirt. And that's, if you look at Leopoldo, what was he doing? He was flirting with Sylvia Odio. And Espinosa too. If you look a little deeper, who was one of his best friends was Rolando Cubela, Amlash One. Who the CIA was hoping to be, the guy that would help them, kill Castro. And these guys were connected. These weren't just people hanging around the house. So I'm probably going into too deep on this. I don't know if
it's interesting. I think what we do need is a anti-Castro organizational chart.
David can give you. David can give you the chart for CIA ops in Miami, as we reverse engineered the chart there. We're working on the chart. He and I are both working on this chart that you just asked for. Yeah, we do need that.
Because these Latino names do kind of roll into each other.
Right.
To be fair,
Long story short, they had the connections to New Orleans. Through New Orleans, where did they get the information to go visit Sylvia Odio, her address in, Dallas, and information about her father's war name and stuff like that? Well, as Larry mentioned before, her uncle, Augustin Guittat, was Bartez's, name we just mentioned, his assistant for the CRC. These guys used to have meetings at Bartez's house. Carlos Quiroga, Bringuier, Ernesto Rodriguez, Barthez, and Guittat. These guys would all meet at Bartez's house. They all knew who Oswald was. Guittat, Barthez, they were, Bringuier, they were all at Oswald's court appearance. They knew who Oswald was. You know what I mean? It's no big leap now to kind of put a lot of these pieces together. If you look at Sylvia Odio's original testimony, you can find this on Mary Farrell, that, she says, they were Cubans, Mexican looking. She gave the description. They said they came from New Orleans. And when they said, how did you, when they, Liebler said, how did you get, how did they get your name and address? She goes, well, my family. Then she goes, oh, well, never mind. It could be because I'm in the paper. I'm kind of, they have articles about me. That's how they could have found out. When you look, she'd only been at her current address for 6 weeks. So I doubt they had her, name and address in the paper. Phone number, that they, how did Leopoldo know to call her the next day? Did she give him his number? Or did he have the number from her uncle? because she would call
Her
her
uncle
uncle.
had the number clearly. I think there's another thing that we stumbled on it, I think, in looking at the details of her testimony, that's really a lot more important and we never really made anything of before. And that's that they took the trouble to express to her, not only did they want her to sign off on some paperwork soliciting money, but they had been told that she was a person who knew how to get people into Cuba.
Right.
And given that we think that what they were doing at that point in time, we may have been off the base in the reason for this visit. If we are correct, and these guys were presenting themselves to Oswald as being pro-Castro, and with the ability to get him into Cuba, which is what he wanted to do, they're taking him to Dallas and saying in front of him that this lady knows how to get people in, you know, because sometimes they're speaking English and sometimes they're speaking Spanish. So we don't know exactly, we can't know what Oswald heard, but we can at least speculate that some of these conversations are set up for Oswald to hear, that they're not real. They're for condition, just like when he goes to McCowan's, why are they there to buy lots of rifles? Not one rifle. They're to buy a whole bunch of rifles to support a revolution in Central America, which is what Oswald has always wanted to do all the way back to the Marine Corps.
So how do we reconcile the Sylvia Odio event with the fact that Oswald was supposed to be in Mexico City on that date? Is that accurate, that statement?
We don't reconcile it because we're not comfortable with the dates.
Okay, so it's a date issue, effectively.
Totally comfortable with the dates. And again, this is recollection after the fact by Sylvia. We can't reconcile it because we don't know. And what can be corroborated says, yes, he's there. This is the right person with the right people. The dates are still a mystery to me. In fact, this whole sequence of events from New Orleans to Mexico is open for investigation. So here's another, we don't know. David, I think we agreed that we didn't know.
Right. There's been some indications that the FBI kind of knew he was there on September 25th. You know, there was that whole gap between, you know, Marina and Ruth Payne left to go to Dallas, and he was there by himself. And they said, well, he may have come the next day, you know, after that. So there is some question by the FBI themselves, and, you know, Sylvia Odio herself was unsure, but she was sure it was Oswald, you know, so, and these two guys. And she never knew the guy, everybody think it was Leopoldo and Angelo. She never knew the other guy's name. She said, I don't remember. It was something like, but I could be wrong. You know, if you read her testimony, also her testimony, she goes, you know, they introduced him as Leon Oswald, but she says, I may have misheard, or he may have said it. He may have made a mistake. Leopoldo may have made that mistake, Leon, you know, so.
Okay, but the bottom line is you both feel very strongly that the Odio event occurred, and we obviously know that you feel very strongly that Oswald was in Mexico City. So it's just a date disconnect that has to be resolved.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got quite a few other questions, but I'd like to open it up to the floor now, because I can see that some stuff has come in the chat. Nancy, you'd like to just press Larry and David on the Paynes.
Sure. I'm interested in your take on Michael and Ruth Payne. I was interested when you started talking, describing, you know, your own research journey in how we evolve our thinking. So what we may have walked into this case with decades ago, based on certain readings, has greatly expanded. As time goes on, you get new information, new documents, you have new discussions, et cetera, and that. So I can absolutely appreciate how opinions evolve. So I'm wondering now at this point, I've gone through my own transitional period with Michael and Ruth Payne. My early articles was, damn them, you know, let's string them up, et cetera, and that. And they have evolved over time to have a much broader perspective on them. and what their interests were, what their desires were, what their political leanings were, what their familial obligations and tendencies were all about, and how that influenced their behaviors on a daily basis, and then more specifically with Lee Oswald himself. So I'm wondering, from your and David's perspective, how you're fitting them in at this point based on your research.
Sure. And Nancy, I'd like to say it's nice to, I remember years ago, your presentations at Lancet and meeting you at least briefly, probably who didn't know who I was then, but it's nice to see the name again after all this time. Basically, I think my views of especially Ruth have become much more personal in the context of the Oswalds and almost kind of situational. I think her views, my view of her when she first met the Oswalds was actually the same a lot of in the white Russian community. When they met the Oswalds, there was a lot of sympathy towards Marina. There was a lot of unsympathy towards Oswald. Oswald was much less likable than Marina was. People tend to like Marina over Oswald. Oswald will get into an argument, Marina won't. And life is difficult for Marina. Not only health problems, dental problems, problems with the children. It's clear that the United States has not turned out to be with Oswald like Russia was with Oswald. It's very clear. So Marina is a sympathetic figure. I see Ruth responding to her, establishing a personal visit. It's Ruth visiting with Marina and Marina visiting with Ruth, and them they have the kids in common. It gets to be very personal. Oswald is almost peripheral to the thing. And when Ruth is helping the Oswald family, to a large extent, she is helping Marina. It's not just the Oswald family. And obviously, as you know, with her separation they had things that they could talk about in common. I suspect if you could hear their conversations, the husband would not necessarily come out well in any conversation at that point in time. Marina was becoming increasingly up and down on Oswald. They would get back together, and it would be good for a little bit. For example, when they go to New Orleans, and you see Ruth's comments on them in New Orleans and Oswald's letters, it shifts. Oswald is really good at one point in time, writes back to both Ruth and Marina, and I'm here and I've got a job, and when she takes them down, everything's good. But then even after a few days there, she sees the situation deteriorating. So I see the Ruth Marina as a very personal thing. Now, and I think Ruth was never all that happy with Lee. And, I'm struck by the fact that when he was in jail and called her about a lawyer, apparently she did not do anything, even as an ACLU member, to reach out and push that issue on her own. Not sure how responsive she was to Oswald. But one thing I do leave open to is the fact that I am suspicious, and this is just a couple of comments that came out, that certainly at some point in time, Ruth may have been considered as a source by the FBI because of her contact with the white Russian community, the Russian community. I can see, we don't have it in document, although I have seen one document that said Hoover was very sensitive about the Paynes, so that something didn't come out as it had on Jack Ruby, that the FBI had actually used Ruby as an informant, a criminal informant. I'm not sure that there was not a connection where she provided information to the FBI, and certainly she was willing to do that. I see nothing suspicious about her providing information on the family, whatever, when she's asked about it after the fact. I don't see that as any sort of a setup. I'll let David chime in because he may not be of my agreement, just to get in front of the whole thing, because I know somebody's going to ask that question. The employment at the school book depository, was this a setup? Was this part of the plot? No, I don't see that. I see it as one woman talking to a group of women in the same block saying, you know, this poor young woman has got a husband. She's having a new baby. He needs work, you know, and the school book depository comes up and she pursues it. She pursues it not so much for Oswald, I don't think, but for Marina's sake. So just to get that off my chest. David, you want to chime in?
Yeah.
David, before you start, could I just interject here?
Sure.
And respond to some of that. You know, I would say back in the early 90s, I used to call Michael and Ruth the couple we love to hate, right? Because especially her, she gave us so much detailed information about Lee and Marina in her testimonies, right? And you're spot on about she had a real willingness to want to share information with the FBI agent who came to visit her. Okay. Is it Hosty or Hosty? I never can.
Hosty, I think.
Okay. And so, yeah, and she was eagerly looking forward to him coming back so that she could give him more information, right? That week before the assassination. And so you know, she was trying to fill a void in her life at that time. She had, you know, she had uprooted herself from Pennsylvania into Dallas. She was living in a very right-wing neighborhood and community that was kind of a little bit beneath her class in terms of financial standing. You know, as far as, you know, her being a bona fide type of agent, she certainly wasn't vetted, and neither was Michael really vetted very strongly, because they didn't even find out about their financial background until she told one of the Warren Commission attorneys in an off-the-record discussion before her testimony in Washington that, well, you know, he has a trust fund. It's like they didn't know anything about that. They were looking for an angle that she had somehow been paid or whatever to do the help with Marina and Lee. And so it was a pretty poor vetting process if either of them was, you know, directly instructed by someone like an Angleton or something like that. And I can't get there yet. I'm still open, okay, for discussion and what might transpire in terms of providing more information, but I can't get there yet. It's kind of like you were saying with Rex Bradford, you know, prove it to me when you tell me something, right? And you know, about 7 or 8 years ago is when I started to shift my attention from Ruth to Michael, because I thought he had not been as forthcoming about exactly how many discussions he had had with Lee, if they had had any physical interactions in terms of the rifle at the shooting range, being picked up at his rooming house on Beckley, those type of things. And so I've been working hard at digging into all of that to try to find out more about him. And you know, there in Max Good's documentary, he has some background footage of his interview with Michael, and you know, Ruth is kind of hovering around him, guiding him in the lone nut scenario. Okay. And I understand that, because that reflects her perspective and what she needs to accept what she did. Okay. That she was not part of some vast conspiracy. But when she leaves the room, he kept filming. And Michael starts going into this whole thing about, hey, there could be a conspiracy. And, you know, there's nothing to say that there couldn't be two. I mean, this is preposterous. Two completely independent actions in Dealey Plaza that day to shoot the president. And neither one knew about the other. And so, you know, in that way, there could be a conspiracy. But he's trying to dance all around it. She goes back in the room and she's got this article that is all about Lone Nut. And she says, well, remember this I gave you to read? So I know he's already in the early stages of dementia at that point, but I found it very interesting that even still at that point, he was raising something other than the lone nut. So they were not in simpatico on that whole concept. So, okay, I'll hush up now and let David go on.
Well, before Nancy, I don't know if you've seen it, but I was always, quite frankly, because everybody seemed to be talking about Ruth, I was more interested in Michael. I found some documents, and I could never recover them. This was just something along the way where Michael had been talking to his friends about Oswald. And the FBI interviewed these Michael friends who were in Dealey Plaza that day. And some of their remarks were like, Michael had talked about it. Maybe somebody needed to keep an eye on Oswald. It was almost suggesting Michael was suspicious of Oswald's leanings, political leanings, whatever. I don't know. But I don't know if you've seen it, but it was tantalizing because it appeared to have, Michael had an interest in Oswald that was different than Ruth's interest in Marina. So I'll just leave that for what it's worth. And
well,
okay,
this
David.
is what happens, right? When you dip your toe into even your own personal counterintelligence operation, which is what I'm thinking that you're kind of leaning toward. You open up a whole quagmire, and you expose yourself to people that you may think are acting in a certain manner or a certain perspective, but lo and behold, they are anything but. And so you end up, walking down this path. I don't know the documents you're referring to. I'm going to certainly go digging. I'm going to ask Joe Backus if he knows anything about something like that, that he can steer me, because I consider him an unofficial document king. And so thank you for sharing that information with all of us for it.
Oh, I've always considered Joe an official document geek. There's never been any doubt in my mind following his
Was that
reports to
geek
the
or
ARB
king?
about that, Joe.
What
Both.
was that? What was that, David?
No, that was Joe.
Yeah, I know. I want to hear it.
Was that geek or king?
Oh, well, okay. I'll go with king. I'm not in vogue with kings at the moment, so I'll give you king, no problem.
Definitely King. That's
Okay.
funny.
Look, we're coming up to an hour or so, an hour and a quarter nearly. I'd like to take one more question from the floor, then we can have a break. Larry, a
Wait a
refreshment.
second, Neil. Neil, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but David, did you have something to add on the Paynes?
On top of you two guys, nothing. You guys, that was tremendous.
Okay.
I learned a lot right there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I'd like to take one more question from the floor, then we can have a comfort break, a refreshment break, and so forth. And I'll pause the recording temporarily. Robert Mance, you have got a question regarding Minsk and Minsk. Do you want to go ahead with that?
Sure, this is just a factual question. And I know we have a situation where there are facts to be verified and then broad questions that need to be explored. I think this is a great book. I love setting the question of Lee's agency as the theme of the book. So that's just an overall comment. On page 73 of your book, you give an account of Lee settling into his apartment in Minsk. And you say that the apartment was bugged and his telephone was tapped. And you cite Ernst Titowitz's Oswald Russian episode as the source for that. I'd like to say that unless you have another source for that telephone, there's been a misreading of Ernst Titowitz's book, because on pages 60 and 61 of Oswald Russian episode, Titowitz makes a big deal that there was no telephone in his apartment. So I guess my question is there other information which contradicts Titovitz and states that Oswald had a telephone in his Minsk apartment?
I'm going to say that that's one of two things happened. Ernst now has 2 books out on Oswald, and I didn't cite from the second book. So 2 things could be happening. A, that literally could be my mistake. And my guess is at this point in time, that's my mistake. And that the reference to telephone is wrong. But I'm going to need to go back and check the second book and maybe drop Ernst a note and say, Notes, did I get it wrong? So you could absolutely be right. I don't recall any discussion of Oswald using the telephone. What I recall is Ernst saying that whenever they were in Oswald's apartment, he was absolutely sure that everything they said was being monitored, which means physical bugs, not telephone bugs.
Sure.
So I'm betting you probably got it right on that one, and I made a mistake.
Sure. And I could go into a lot more, but just to introduce myself, and I did speak with you briefly when you reported to the meeting at DPUK in September. So I've only been at this for 2 years. So you know a lot more than I do. But the reason I got interested, and Nancy referred to this a minute ago, Max Good's documentary. I saw that a couple of years ago, and I recognized Michael Payne as someone I used to take the boat to Nishan to every summer.
Oh, yeah, right. I remember it. Yeah.
In other words, my former wife is the daughter of Michael Payne's mother's brother, one of the Forbeses. So I was married to a first cousin of Michael Payne on his mother's side for 25 years. I never actually talked to Michael Payne. I've seen him on the boat. And I know all his first cousins, and I've met all his aunts and uncles, and for that matter, his mother. I've also spent in this time an awful lot of time with one of his cousins who knew Michael and has been very willing to share memories of Michael and Ruth. In fact, this first cousin caught Ruth's bouquet at their wedding. So I've had an awful lot of ability to form some thoughts about this interesting, extensive New England family, of which Michael is a member, and Ruth is, of course, married and in-law, just like me. So I just wanted to say that. I've done an awful lot of research, and I have posed as the question that I want to figure out, why was Michael Payne hanging out with Lee Oswald in 1963? And what does that tell me about who Lee Oswald was? And I won't go into my thoughts about that, but I really appreciate your book. And as I say, particularly the question that you posed to write it.
Oh, yeah. I remember us talking about the camping or the outdoor visits. I'm with Nancy. I'm still very interested in Michael and why he was hanging out with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, I mean, to some extent, what we show in the book is if you shared certain of Lee's views, he could be very friendly and de Mohrenschildt said he enjoyed talking with him because it wasn't like talking with most people in Dallas, even de Mohrenschildt's son.
Yeah.
Oswald is a liberal progressive in Dallas in 1963. And, you know, you can find 5 of those people. And Michael may have just like, okay, this is somebody that I can go to, who will go to an ACLU rally with me. Okay, how many people are going to really go? If they went to it would be interesting to know what they talked about about a Walker rally, you know. So
Right.
that's fascinating to me, because Michael is the only other person, not in the spring. And somebody asked me recently, it's kind of like, weren't they together in the spring? I don't think they really, no, that was Ruth and Marina and Oswald. But that fall, Michael did seem to be hanging out with Oswald a bit. And I would love to know, was it just the things that they had philosophically in common, or what? But he's like the only other guy in Dallas that seems to get along with Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah.
And, you know, and this is with Lee Harvey's living, his family is with Ruth, who Michael is separated from. This is fascinating. If somebody had written a fictional story about it, just this alone would be worth a book.
Yes. Well, I'll give you my, sure, I know Neil, you said a break, but I'll give you my short take on it, which is actually 180 degrees from yours. In other words, I sort of agreeing on all the factual basis, adding in Herbert Philbrick and David Ferry. I'm right now sitting on the side of Lee's leftism is an assumed provocation, and he's doing what Herbert Philbrick did, which was to out communists. What I can add in terms of the Forbes family background that the community is not aware of is, and of course, Michael's biological father as a security risk is well known. My father-in-law at that time was corresponding with his former lover, a socialist in Sweden, the winner of the Stalin Peace Prize, who had been in 1953, who in 1952 had been a member of the Needham Commission in investigating American biological warfare in Korea. Michael's, another one of Michael's maternal uncles, or rather married to his mother's sister, had been a principal at Fort Detrick in 1943 and done groundbreaking work in the development of production methods for botulinum toxin, and was a familiar of a whole bunch of familiar names at the Fort Detrick in the early days of Camp Detrick, basically the team that came in from Wisconsin with Ira Baldwin to get everything going. So there are a whole bunch of security risk connections of Michael's relatives that someone who wanted to be aware of all that was going on in the Dallas area and make sure that he was informed, as J. Walton Moore was supposed to, why someone would want someone hanging out with Michael Payne. That's my sort of where I am. But I hope I haven't overstayed my question, but everything that you've written is, I think, factually profoundly interesting. And we have a mirror question. Which side of the mirror are we on?
Yeah. I guess it's the same. Garrison faced the same mirror question. You know, we're always going to face the same. Are we looking, which side of the mirror are we looking at?
Yes.
Well, on that note, Larry, I think we're gonna pause for a few minutes for a comfort break, get a beer or whatever, and then I'll come back, and I'll go back to the people that have started asking questions in the chat. Okay.
Sure. Okay, be back in
I'm-
a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes, just going to pause it, okay? Okay, all right, we're back. So, we want to go to the floor. Pete Miller, you've got a question, haven't you, regarding Robert Webster? Pete, I can see you lurking in the background. There you go. You need to put your audio on.
Yeah,
There we go.
yeah. I was interested when you touched on the subject of Webster in the USSR, and I got back to Gary Hill's The Other Oswald book, where he stated that Marina Oswald had Webster's address in Leningrad in her address book. What's your feeling on that?
Well, I guess, and I don't want to claim I know too much about it, but I think one of the things that we do know about Marina is that she was very interested in foreigners. She dated foreigners, not just Americans, but foreigners overall. And one of the reasons that she was actually asked to leave was that she showed too much interest in foreigners. And so I guess from that matter, I'm not sure if anyone has ever checked her address book to see if who was in it. Were there other Americans in it? But Webster, to me, if it's interesting, that was in Leningrad, where she was really interested in meeting foreigners and dating them, and quite frankly got a reputation for dating foreigners that made her stand out. Whereas when we get to Minsk, she doesn't seem to be focusing on foreigners anymore, and Ernst goes into considerable detail how it's like Oswald got focused on her because how much of a social figure she was. So it's kind of different in Leningrad versus Minsk. But I would just say, to cross-check that, it's like someone should take a look at that book and see how many other Americans or foreigners would be in it.
Yeah, I've never seen the book, and I'm just going off what was in Hill's book, but I assume it exists, or else he wouldn't have put it in there. But yeah,
It's interesting to think that Marina had a little red book. It's kind of like in the 50s, this is kind of like Contra. Who has the little red book? It's the guys. No, Marina has the little red book.
yeah. Okay.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Brooks, you've got a question.
Yeah, I think my question almost kind of answers itself. If in fact you believe that Oswald went there as a false defector, but in the recent release of documents, I just saw this the other day, and I think the source, the memo actually was a Soviet one, but it said that the only way that a couple like Oswald and Marina got out of the Soviet Union, period, much less got their visa in record time, was that they were going to go to the U.S. and spy. And so that raises the question, was Marina the one who was the designated spy, or did the Soviets flip Oswald? There was some insinuation about that in some of these new documents as well. But anyway, we all know that her uncle was KGB, the fact that Webster was in her diary. And I can't cite the source, but I believe Webster was in Angleton's program of false defectors. I think Webster might have been either the second or the third, and then Oswald followed him immediately. So you essentially have Marina engaged with back-to-back defectors. And so you start connecting dots. There's so much of that's just a statistical aberration that's like a 1 in a million. But clearly, once they got to the U.S., the white Russian community in Dallas-Fort Worth had the exact same sentiments. I mean, they swarmed all around the Oswalds, and they were both amazed and suspicious of their story. So assuming that this were all true, and Marina is actually engaged by the Soviets to come over here and spy. That same memo that I was citing said that there would be a sponsor or a handler for them once they got in country. So I have, my question is, who would that have been? Would it have been Gregory?
Well,
But
I
literally,
think I have to start, to be honest, to go back and challenge a lot of those assumptions and a lot of that dot connection. I mean, I'm familiar with all that, but first of all, Marina did not come out of the Soviet Russia gracefully. Neither did Lee. There's a period of time, well over a year, when if you look at the correspondence, and Newman does a great job with this, of exposing all the detailed correspondence. The State Department did not want Lee back. They opposed him at every angle and pushed back against them. They asked him to do things that legally he couldn't do, like travel from Minsk to Moscow. They constantly pushed back against him. They didn't want him back. You can read their correspondence saying,
well, keep in mind, Larry, you just cited early on that the CIA was perplexed as to how Oswald got into the country and all of that. That's because everything is so compartmentalized that if Angleton is running this program, 99.9% of the people in the CIA aren't even aware of it. So they think he truly is a defector. The State Department believes that he's truly a defector. There were intelligence reports coming out of Minsk.
Well,
so
okay, but
were
let me
those
finish,
Oswalds?
let me finish my line of thought, and
right,
then you can keep yours.
Okay.
But my line of thought is the State Department proven factual history is that they pushed back against both Lee and Marina. They didn't want Lee back. If the CIA wanted back and Angleton wanted it back, that's a different story. But what we've got for the history is the State Department didn't want him back. Russia opposed, and again, Ernst does a great job with this. The Russians were not happy about Marina. I'm sorry. She was, as soon as they found out about Russia's appeals to come back with his family, she gets interrogated by the groups that she belongs to, because she has to belong to certain groups, even to have her credentials as a pharmacist assistant. They push back to her. They harass her. In fact, things get so bad that she actually goes to live with an aunt for a while because she's under so much stress because people are harassing her at work and making her explain this. So I guess my first point is I would object to the fact that they came back to the U.S. gracefully, either one of them. It was a long period of time. It was a lot of correspondence. It was a lot of struggles. We see absolutely the same thing on the other end when in January 1963, both Lee and Marina start contacting the Soviets about returning to Russia, especially Marina. And that goes on all year long. So whatever Angleton is doing, that's a different story. I'm not arguing that point. But as far as Lee and Marina with the U.S. State Department and the Soviet bureaucracy in Moscow are having troubles going and coming. It's not easy. One of the reasons the CIA memo is curious about all of this is, why are they coming back? How did he get over there? That part of the CIA may not know that Angleton is behind all this. I can't know that. All I can do is I am declaredly, this doesn't speak for David, a minimalist. I have seen way too many conspiracy theories generated by connecting the dots, which of course is what we do in the third part of the book. So, okay, I understand. But I think a lot of times I have to just stay with the history that I can see. And as far as your question about a sponsor, I will say we all know that Hosty in his own book says that he was more concerned about Marina in terms of possible connections as a Soviet source. He was concerned about her more than he was about Lee. But I will also point out, and this is jumping back to a much higher level, if I were in Soviet intelligence, why is Lee Harvey Oswald, who's going to go back to the US under the cloud of being a Russian defector. I know he's never going to get a decent job. He's never going to have access to security materials. He's already cut his own throat in the US, which he provably did, could never get anything other than a manual labor job. Why do I want to send a wife agent with him? What's she going to accomplish? So I would have to raise the counter question is, what in the world are you expecting out of Marina Oswald when you send her back to the US as a spy?
Well, it just, in some cases, I think you're throwing mud at the wall and hoping, right? We know that, and you know, you never know what you're going to get, but if you throw enough, it's like when the CIA was parachuting agents into China, hoping that somehow they wouldn't all be killed and they might bear some fruit. You know, and you literally are throwing mud at the wall. But just quickly, two other data points, and you're absolutely right. And all the work we do as researchers, we get to a point where we have nothing to explain the void, so we have to connect the dots and we fill in the space. But people were really amazed at the fact that Oswald apparently got back into the country without going through a severe interrogation process. That's another data point. And the other thing is, as you quoted per Hosty, it appears the FBI was really on the Oswald's case big time when they got back, and to the point that I think Oswald felt that they were harassing his wife and him, and he got obviously quite upset about that. So, you know, all we can do is basically fill in the voids, and we all have opinions as to what goes into that space. So,
and I would agree with you on that last point. I would also raise, and it's something we raised in the book and didn't make a huge amount of, we didn't bold it or anything like that. But I think David and I are both suspicious that Oswald did provide information to get back into the United States, that he actually provided information via the State Department, maybe even during a stopover on his way back. He may have provided information on his time in the Soviet Union, and that was routed. We can actually trace a trail of information finally being routed to the Soviet division long after it should have been, that he may well have provided and that he was upset about. I do not at all write off the fact that his complaint and his writings on the boat back was that he would never be forced to be used by anybody else again. So in some fashion, he was used in regarding information from the, even though, quite frankly, you know, the information that he could have would be limited to the sort of thing we see in his manuscript. We can see what he wrote in his manuscript about his time in the Soviet Union, about his time in the factory, his observations. That's the sort of thing that he could have provided. It's not like he had access to anything beyond his own observations. But I don't want to write off the concept that Oswald did provide information and felt he'd been used in doing so. David, do you want to? I would like to give David a chance because he can say, no, that was Larry's idea and he's nuts.
No, that was Larry's idea and he's nuts.
Good. Thanks, David.
No, I think you're right. Didn't he write, wasn't there an unsigned report about the radio factory in Minsk that everybody suspected that Oswald wrote and provided to?
And that's been pretty well proved that information was circulated back from state to CIA. And when there was an investigative reporter, I forget the name, who actually during the period of the HSCA found that report and actually interviewed someone who said, and we cover this in the book, by the way, who said that he had been given information that appeared to have come from a Marine in a factory in Minsk. That's got to be Oswald. And someone would have talked, I expanded on that way back when, the fact that there's actually a memo, internal memo within the CIA that says this reporter was onto the story, but we've managed to divert him and we think we're going to be good because he thinks he's not going to break it. But yeah, absolutely, that's true. And there's a case to be made that information was taken and on record from a Marine in a factory in Minsk, and there are not that many of them.
So, Larry, in terms of the timing of this, was this information potentially given in Minsk or in the Netherlands or on the boat on the way back? When do you,
I had a conversation with a fellow the other day. I always thought it was two things. It could have been with the State Department itself when he went to Moscow. Could have been
Right.
with the State Department because State was reporting everything back to CIA and FBI. That's where they were getting their information from Oswald. Could have been in Moscow as part of a quid pro quo. We're finally going to break down and let you come back, but you got to give us some information. Or the fellow that I had a conversation with the other day was talking about a stopover, an unexplained gap of time. I think it was in the Netherlands on his way back that could have been the place to do that. Either of those would have been preferable to doing it inside the U.S. because it keeps it out of view. One thing we do know is it's the real false defectors that were taken apart, false defectors and the real defectors that agreed to provide information like Webster, that were taken apart to someplace in the U.S. for 2 or 3 weeks and debriefed by trained CIA domestic ops guys to collect the targeted information. We do write about that in the book. So, Neil, I suspect it was done overseas.
Neil, can I just
Which
say,
is why he would
Gary,
say on the boat, like it's already been done. He would be writing on the boat that I've already given, been used.
Neil, Gary said he signed up patiently there for a few minutes. I wondered if we would want to bring him in and ask a question.
Just before that, Scott, just the information that he would have provided. What value is it? I mean, he's working in a factory. What's he going to say? I went to Communist Party dances.
It's one level deeper than open source information. As we just had in the you collect all the information you can. What's the security structure inside the factory? Where were you allowed to go? Did you have to have a particular pass to get into an area? Could you just walk around? There are all sorts of operational details. Just how did they treat you? Who talked to you? Were you interrogated? I mean, I can go through a whole list, and John Newman does that. It's like, did they interrogate you? Did they ask you for certain types of information? They knew you were a radar operator. Did you question you on certain radar systems? Did they question you on the, passwords and codes that were used for air traffic control in Los Angeles? Just I can think of a whole host of questions that are just kind of routine in a way about what they did with you. We want to know what they did with you because we might want to send somebody in, and this just helps us prepare.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Gary, your question?
Yeah, I need to push back a little bit, Larry. I mean, I am hearing things that add to my scenario. But back in '95, I interviewed a guy named Melvin Levine here in suburban Minneapolis. And I had accidentally caught him being part of an investigative report on a Minneapolis station. The station got permission from this guy's daughter, excuse me, to interview him. So I went to his house. He's about 90 years old. He was the head of defectors at INS, Melvin Levine. And he told me the same story over the next couple hours that he told on the 7-minute TV spot. And it was that he had turned Oswald's application down 3 times to return. And each time his higher ups at INS would say, come on, what's the big deal? Let him back in. No, I'm not letting him back in. He's a traitor. Now, this guy at INS had, Levine had control over the defector programs. And finally, the 4th time he was in the process of turning him down, and a guy named Michael Saplinski, a Polish immigrant in the State Department, overruled INS and said, you will let him back in. And he's actually interviewed, or he's actually shown in the videotape done by the Minneapolis station back in 1995. And I spaced out on him for a long time. I'm working on him now. But at some point, the State Department changed their tune. And they wanted him back. And so I guess if there's a question there, it's about, do you have a sense of when that transition took place? Because just yesterday, someplace, I ran across a reference to 3 people who were instrumental in the State Department in bringing Oswald back. And one was the ambassador to Russia, Llewellyn Thompson, which is almost a household name. So at some point, the State Department was saying, we want him back. Now, it could be that the head of counterterrorism, what's his name?
Angleton?
I'm sorry, if it's not a Cuban name, I can't remember.
No, the one that
James
is
Angleton?
with Jefferson Morley's research.
Angleton.
Angleton, yeah.
Oh, Angleton. Oh, him I remember, yeah.
It could be that Angleton at some point is in the loop with the State Department and changes their mind, is my hunch. But
Could be.
you know,
I wouldn't, I guess my response is that wouldn't, first of all, we do, I mean, I'm very suspicious of Angleton's control over Oswald's information. So I'm not writing that off at all. And he may have decided at some point would be more useful to see, let Oswald do something new and let's track that information. But I think I'd be more inclined, I would agree with you, Gary. I think that there's a point, I think it was fairly late in the cycle where State Department essentially broke Oswald and said, look, you're a traitor, we don't like you, but you know, we're always open to information. If you want to give us some information, you can use, you never know what we can't know what the conversations are like. Oswald may have said what he said in his manuscript. He may have said, I'm fed up with the Russians. You know, I don't like the communist system. It didn't do what it claimed to do. The Soviets are using the Communist Party's if he said anything of that, it would have been very appealing. It's like, okay, you were there. Now you decided you don't like them and you're talking against them. You know, would you write that down later? By the way, we might even want to use that. Or I think they broke him to a certain extent. He started saying things they wanted to hear and agreed to give certain information. I think the thing that surprised me, if trying to, not that I have an intelligent hat, but if I had one and put it on, the first thing I would have done if I was actually controlling the situation, when Oswald got off the boat, I would have interviewed him and had him say exactly the same thing that he wrote like 5 months later in Dallas, everything that would have been negative and pure gold propaganda against the Soviet Union. And it's what he had learned to be fed up with. It's bureaucracy, only the higher levels. And, you know, he was a propaganda gold mine that they didn't use for some, either they didn't realize he was a propaganda, you know, I don't know. But I would agree with you that there's a point in the time that a decision was made, okay, either based on what he's saying or what somebody else said, that he gets to come back.
Yeah, the State Department and this Michael Saplinski, when they pushed him to answer why are you letting him back, he says, and this is in the 1995 videotape actually in Minneapolis, he says, well, you know, it's our job just to keep families together and bring them back. And so they use a cover as Marina being a new mother and not wanting to separate them. So there's something going on there too that fits what you're saying in terms of a transition in their attitude.
Yeah, there is a total change in attitude. It's kind of, you look at some of these statements and what did the Russians say? It's kind of like, well, we wouldn't want to break up the family. And, you know, it's like, suddenly it's all good. Whereas for the better part of a year, they've just been harassing them unmercifully. I'm with you. I can't say which way it is. We're gonna. It's like that mirror thing again. Which side of the mirror are you looking at?
Do you think Titovitz was? I mean, some people say he was a KGB babysitter for Oswald, but I spent 4 days with Titovitz in Dallas in 13, and well, it's a long story as far as how that happened, but at any rate, I would say either he's a very good actor posing as the best friend of Oswald, or he literally was the best friend. I was with him at the moment that Oswald was killed 50 years earlier. We were at the Egyptian lounge, and he got very emotional, and I didn't understand why. And then it dawned on me that it was because it was 50 years to the hour that his best friend for 3 years in Minsk was assassinated, and the people at the Egyptian lounge, we were acting like tourists. We were poking around the restaurant, and he was sitting by himself, very quiet. And I said, "Ernst, what's wrong?" And then at that instant, it dawned on me that he was reflecting on what had happened that hour 50 years earlier. And so I just have no sense that he was being used by the KGB to screw over Oswald. But
Oh, I'm with you. He's still emotional about it. I don't sense any. No, I don't sense any. He says, was he questioned about? Sure, he was questioned, but as far as a handler or no, I see him as being very honest about being a friend. In some of the details he relates, pros and cons about Oswald, it's kind of like, your best high school friend is now telling you the full story of what high school was like. They had to be real friends to get that kind of empathy, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, I want to bring in Scott in a minute, but just before I do that, and he's got a question around the Walker note. From the book.
Yes, we all do. Yeah.
From the book, it seems to me that you think that Oswald was involved in the Walker shooting, and it seems to me that you think that the backyard photos are genuine. So could you just outline your core view on those two things, and then we can segue into Scott's question on the note?
First of all, I see, to me, we have a legitimate explanation, given what we feel of Oswald's character, to explain the backyard photo and why he would suddenly be holding up a magazine, claiming I'm establishing my reputation as an activist and whatever. And why Marina, this is the finishing touch to that. And I'll be perfectly honest, is Marina taking a copy of that, writing on the back that, this is a fascist. This is Marina with Lee. This is real world. Like, this is my husband, the jerk. Okay. That sort of thing speaks to me like, okay, I don't think my wife would do it, but I'm not sure she wouldn't do it. But as far as the Walker thing, yeah, I think it's with the photographs, with what's in his notebook. I don't see any reason to disassociate Oswald being focused on Walker. I mean, he's become of a mindset. He's very opposed to fascism. And this is a local opportunity. This is somebody he can, reach out and I don't know. I don't think he probably had any plan from the beginning, but I think those photographs are very real. He did go to Oswald's house. He didn't just go take a picture from the front. He took pictures from all angles, which has to lead you to think, well, maybe he has something in mind, not just, he could, knowing Oswald, quite frankly, if he, at least the way I think I've come to know him, if he wanted to call out Oswald walked up to the front door, knocked on it, and said, "You're a jerk." Oswald was not bashful. He had no fear. If he wanted to call you out, he would call you out. But there's something else going on here with him just taking photographs and apparently, going around the house. He knows where the alley is. So I have no reason to doubt that there's a connection between he and Walker, that part is real. I have every reason to doubt that we'll ever know exactly what went on. I think Gail Nix Jackson has done some excellent work in looking at a fuller picture of what might have gone on. Did the best I could say is he may have been observed around the Walker house at night, because we do have a report that said somebody reported someone lurking around the house before the night of the shooting. Were they watching for him to come back? Did they chase him? Did he actually get there and shoot at the house? I don't believe Walker was in the room when that shot occurred. I think we're looking at a lot of bogus stuff coming from Walker and his people after the fact, taking advantage of it. Now, whether Lee took the shot and ran, or were there some of Walker's people that took the shot after someone had been there and used it, I don't claim to know. And I don't know how we will ever know for sure. But yeah, I do think that part was real, and that does not, I don't find that out of character for Oswald. Oswald was something of a drama queen, which we try to point out in the book. He was not bashful. He could be in your face. He could be, it's kind of like the incident with Bringier. Hit me. The TV cameras are here. Hit me. Slitting his wrist. This is not a bashful guy.
Pulling the gun out in the Russian embassy.
Yeah.
That's
very much in character.
Another
I'm afraid for my life. Let me in, sign off on this visa. David, that's enough.
I have a couple
David,
things
you
to
got
say.
anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think Gail did some good work on putting Robert Surrey with Oswald be involved something. I think Scott Reed's done some really good work on that whole situation himself. So again, it's complex, the old, next day Walker's going on tour with Billy James Hargis. Was it a publicity stunt? Did they try and tie Oswald into it afterwards? Was he really there, or just looking at Walker's house? We get the photographs that Oswald took, but was he really involved? In the actual shooting, I don't know. As far as the backyard photos, this copy of The Militant that he's holding up, well, his letter was published in that. That's why he's trying to, he's holding it up. That copy we got, in our research, we found the letter that Oswald wrote to The Militant, notes from Dallas, and he signed it LH, all the notes. So I'm sure Scott has something to say.
Well, I think we should bring in Scott, because he's done a lot of deep research.
Agreed.
Deep research into the whole Walker saga, and obviously, if you can just elaborate on your question as well, Scott.
Yeah, certainly happy to have a wider discussion about Walker. But can I just I got into the Walker shooting really through finding out about a compatriot called William Duff, who gets a mention in the new book. And it actually gives me a chance to thank David, because a few years ago he sent me the transcript of the tape recording of Duff with Walker's two private investigators when they were driving around the Turtle Creek area. So David, thank you for sending that to me.
Cheers, Scott.
all those years ago. I appreciated that. The question specifically, though, it was something that I read in the book which was new to me, and I don't know if it's maybe just a lost in translation thing, but it mentions that Ruth Payne found the note in the Russian language book, and my understanding was that she was unaware of the note, but passed the book to the Secret Service, and it was them that found the note. It would be interesting for me to know if you feel that Ruth Payne, it was actually Ruth that found the note and then passed the book to the authorities, or whether that's just kind of, it's just not been, you know, confirmed. Can somebody answer that? Did Ruth find the note?
David, I mean, off the top of my head, okay, off the top of my head, what I recall is that she found the book and passed the book. If this may be like the telephone thing we discussed earlier, that may be my wording mistake. I don't recall her, and maybe Nancy will recall this. I better than I don't recall her finding the book and the passing the note separately from the book to the FBI. It was like she passed it together to the FBI. Nancy, you probably recall better than I do. If Nancy's still here. David, do you recall better than I do?
I do not on that particular issue, Larry.
So I think, Scott, you may be right. That may be a miswording, or we weren't specific enough. I do not recall a description of her like opening up the book and the note falling out and her contacting the FBI.
It might just be the way it's written in the book. It certainly says that was
Let's
initially
blame it on
brought.
Rex. David, what do you think?
Yeah.
He's the editor. That's his fault.
It's
Okay.
always Rex's fault.
Yeah.
Okay, here
Yeah.
I'm back. I had some technical issues. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
My recollection on that is that she found the book. I don't think the book was in Russian. I think it was a book on caring for children. She did not find the note inside. I have asked her specifically about that. Did you flip through the book? Was there a bookmark in it? Was there anything, you know, that sticking out of it, anything that you saw or whatever? And she was pretty adamant that she had not seen it.
Yeah.
My belief is that had she seen it, it was written in Russian, and because it was for Marina, right? And so it was a rather lengthy list, and so rather than have that in English, it was definitely written in Russian. And that had she seen that, she would have been able to translate it and read exactly what it was saying, and she would have connected the dots on that.
Yeah.
And she would have been on the phone to Hosty so fast
Yeah.
to tell him about that, rather than just simply turning over it with a couple of other items too at the same time. Because she also found some Mexico City stuff, right? That was loose and laying around. So that's the facts of it as I recollect.
I think that's absolutely right. And I don't know if Rex is going to do another edition of the book, but if we would, I'd certainly reword that. And I think actually, wasn't it something like a housekeeping tips book or a
book of
yeah.
helpful instructions,
Yeah.
I think it was. I mean, the note is really interesting because, as Nancy said there, I mean, the police, well, Ruth Payne testified that she saw the police at her home in Irving leafing through books as if they were looking for something. Now, whether they actually leafed through that particular book or not, who knows? But she certainly said they were leafing through books and didn't find anything. So that's always a bit odd to me. And also that the note came into kind of being not long after the German newspaper had printed that they felt that Oswald was behind the Walker shooting. Oswald and Marina's fingerprints weren't found on the note, which I don't know what to make of that, whether fingerprints would necessarily still be on a note 6 months, on a piece of paper 6 months later. I don't know, but there were certainly fingerprints found on the note. Obviously, the note doesn't mention Walker. It's not dated. And it's significant that about a week after the Walker shooting, Oswald was out on the streets of Dallas handing out Fair Play for Cuba committee leaflets, which is little known. We know a lot more about the New Orleans leafleting, but the Dallas leafleting is less well known, although it's fairly certain that Oswald was doing that. And I mean, I'm not the only one, but others have speculated that if Oswald actually wrote the note, that it could have been in relation to that particular leafleting incident. And the only witness that we've really got, or kind of significant witness, I think, is the teenager who saw the two men leaving the scene of the shooting, and they left in two separate cars, and he saw one of them kind of like leaning into the back seat as if he was putting something there. Now, those two men were almost at the lane entrance. I mean, by the time Coleman heard the shot, and by the time he could have got from where he was in the house to looking over the fence, would pretty much have given those individuals enough time to get from the shooting location to where he saw them. So those two guys are significant because they were either involved or they must have known what happened. And we've never heard from them. We don't know who they are. And you know, they just disappeared into history, really. So there's a lot around the Walker shooting that would actually, in a way, exonerate Oswald, or at least indicate that, you know, if he was involved, he was involved with more than one. It wasn't just him. There's obviously the bullet as well, the steel jacketed bullet that the police said that they found. There's a whole load of things that are interesting around the Walker shooting. I agree, Larry, that we will probably never know for sure what happened.
I guess my final comment would be the only thing that strikes me that I don't find it. I think that if Walker's people had recruited Oswald, which has been put forth also, and that he was working with Oswald's people and they knew who Oswald was. I don't know the timeline for how that would have developed, but I also think that they would have absolutely thrown him under the bus. You know, if he can be connected to shooting at Walker, it's a great propaganda thing for them. You know, Russian defector shoots at I don't know how I can see how them chasing him away or taking advantage of the situation, staging the shooting. I have a hard time thinking that they knew it was Lee Harvey Oswald and they don't, you know, go after him. That's just my only other thought.
Yeah. I mean, the FBI report that you mentioned in the book as well, I mean, they got involved later. I think it was about a year later. I mean, I don't know what to make of that either, because they say, for example, that the distance that Coleman, who's the teenager who held the shot, the distance from him hearing the shot to actually looking over the fence was only 14 feet. And they estimated it would only have taken him 2 seconds to get there. Now, that would put a different slant on the two men and where they were standing 2 seconds before the shot was fired. But my understanding is Coleman was inside the house, so actually had to move along in the house and then come out. So it would have been a lot more than 14 feet and a lot more than 2 seconds. So that would then place the men in a different position when Coleman heard the shot. So I just feel that a lot of the reporting, not in your book, but a lot of reporting in general, it's just a fait accompli that Oswald shot at Walker, and it's much more nuanced than that. It's much more complicated than that.
Oh,
I can see Gary's got his hand in. If Gary's got his hand up, if he's wanting to come in.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that in '99, I interviewed the Life magazine's managing editor, and then in '63 he was kicked up to manager, and he micromanaged 600 consecutive issues of Life magazine, and he was in charge or in possession of the backyard photo, and Rankin had to badger him 4 different times to get the original backyard photo negatives. And he resisted and resisted. And finally, Rankin says, I want it here by, I think sometime in May during the Warren Commission. And I want it here by 4:30 next Tuesday. So Ed Thompson, who I'm referring to here, he finally sends it to Rankin with a note that says, I just touched up the photo. I touched it up around his ankle, around his elbow, around the butt of the gun, around his shoulder. Now, Ed Thompson was hired by Henry Luce as not only editor, but originally, of course, he was the photo analyst or photo expert for Life magazine. And his claim to fame and why Luce hired him was he had invented or perfected compositing of photos so that you couldn't see the cut lines. So there's one theory that says that the backyard photo, you know, like Jack White will say, was somebody's head on somebody else's body. And of course, Oswald said that while just after he got arrested. So there is some background to the notion that the photo was faked, and therefore he didn't do the Walker shooting. But I interviewed his widow for 6 straight hours and never brought up the assassination. But she finally said, do you want to see my husband's retirement party at Life magazine? She picks up a videotape, and at about minute 11 in the videotape, there are 3 superimposed shots on the tape. No reason to be there. I said, what was that? She says, I don't know. Well, she was at the roast. And she gave me a copy. And I played it at Lancer in Dallas, I think it was. And at any rate, here's Life magazine, which now, according to James Wagenvord, is up to their neck in being a part of the CIA operations. Here's Life magazine saying that we have to preserve the idea that there were 3 shots. And they commemorated it in a roast for Ed Thompson, who felt it his duty, and he self-described himself as a fascist because his boss, Henry Luce, told him he was a fascist. I guess I am too. So here you got this fascist operation in the loop. It's wild when you think about it. Anyway.
Can I just add a final? Sorry, Larry, or David, sorry, did you want to?
So, just expanding on that a little bit, that Bill Harvey was good friends with the Luces, so, there's a great connection right there. He actually was in June 30th, 1963, right after he went to Rome as chief of station. He actually said, I want to be able to contact the Luces. And we actually have that document, like, these are my friends, Claire Booth Luce, who's hooked up with the DRE. And, so there is some good connections there. Good, Scott.
The only thing, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, on you go, Larry, you go.
I was just going to say the only thing surprising to me is that Claire Booth did not give this report that Oswald was part of the Cuban rifle team coming out of Mexico City to her husband, and it wasn't on the front page of something on November 23rd. That's kind of amazing. It's like, why did they not take that as an opportunity? You wouldn't have even had to validate it. All you had to do would be to feed it into the loose media network, and it's done, and we attack Cuba immediately.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to conclude by saying that I've always found it interesting that Oswald, if he took the shot at Walker, or people who say that he did, the police found no evidence. They found no cartridge. They found, I think they quote, no evidence of value. Yet when he's allegedly supposed to have shot the president, he's left the cartridges behind. He's left the rifle behind, just a few feet away. He's left his wallet behind at the tippet scene. None of that. Well, yeah, indeed. None of that really makes a lot of sense.
He left his jacket behind, and he left his clipboard behind. He's very, very forgetful.
Yeah.
Yep,
He
indeed.
became more or less bashful over time, I guess. It's, whatever. It certainly his tradecraft didn't improve. We could say that much. It's like, oh, wait a minute, you were able to. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, here's my rifle, my bullets, my wallet,
I will get to the some of these other questions that are coming through the chat, but Johnny asked a few questions, one of which I dealt with, which I think was David Ferree. Johnny's not here anymore. He's gone to the pub. I don't know. I don't know
Good
whether
choice.
I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing, but let's start off. I mean, Johnny's, you probably know that he's written a review of the book and he's published this on Kennedy's and King. So perhaps I can just press you on what I think is quite an important area, which is this whole communist red mentality in the military and in the Marines. And you've obviously read his critique. It does seem very, very odd that if he is a genuine hard left leaning persona, that he's able to get away with these numerous incidents that is reinforcing this notion of him being very, very hard left, very pro-Soviet Union, and arguably anti-United States. So how does this guy just not get the shit kicked out of him?
Yeah.
In these various bases, probably by more hick orientated soldiers that just wouldn't tolerate this kind of thing. It's not like he was doing it in subtle ways. This is extremely overt. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, I think first of all, Johnny needed to talk to some of the Marines that I did.
Sure.
Because that was one of the first questions I asked. I asked one of my current friends, not Jack, who's passed away, but my current friends, career military, career Marine officer, like what would happen? He said, first thing he said is Oswald's not unique. We had a mix of guys in the barracks. There's always one or two, I forget whether he called them beatniks or, weirdos or whatever, who's in barracks, who has opinions that are different than the rest of the guys. Okay. They may be political. He said when he was in the service, he knew Oswald types in barracks who were politically different from the rest of the Marines and different in their regular behavior patterns. They didn't go out drinking as much. They read more. They were free hippies, whatever you want to call it, was not unusual. Did they get harassed sometimes? Not so much, maybe if it was a training barracks, maybe, but Oswald wasn't talking like that in training barracks. Oswald did not really talk about that. You need to look at where he talked about that and was more voluble, and that occurs towards the end of his time in the Marine Corps when he's in barracks with guys who they're just living together. They're not bonded, they're not whatever. And my Marines friends say, hey, that's not unusual. If he did something was much worse than talking off politics, would be if he didn't do his chores around the barracks, if he wasn't cleanly, whatever, then he'd get harassed. He might get a scrubbing party, which I've seen in the military myself. He might get booted out of that barracks to another barracks or another whatever. It depends on what. This is real world. These are real world Marines talking to me. Did they find his behavior unusual? Yeah. Something that would be provocative? No. Delgado certainly didn't find it provocative when he's talking about going to join the Castro Revolution. What we think is provocative in the rearview mirror in 1959 is a different story. Joining Castro, the U.S. is still, there's no boycott of the Castro regime. He's not even declared communist yet during the revolutionary period. So their views was, no, his behavior is not as unusual as you might think it would. Would it be reported to an officer? My friend said, yeah, it might be reported to the officer. And the officer, here's what he said. He said, the officer would call him in and counsel him on it and say, look, Marine, if you keep talking about this, you're not going to get your next stripe. You know, if you want to get ahead in the Corps and you want to, but by this time, Oswald's already been in the brig twice. He's already lost stripes. My friend said, you know, they're not even going to talk to him. They're just going to, he's not going to stay in the service. He's not going to have a Marine cure. So who cares what he says? Their concern might they have counseled him? Maybe, depending on when this happened. They probably did counsel him. You know, like I said, he ended up in the brig twice. He lost at least one stripe. He didn't get a promotion to corporal that he was expecting, and he didn't get to extend his stay overseas, what he wanted. So there was pushback about Oswald as an individual not within the Marine system, right? Okay, this is not a guy for the Corps. And by the time he came back to the U.S., Oswald clearly was not going to be re-enlisting. He'd applied to go to college in Europe, right, in Switzerland. So we know that. They said what was more interesting to them was the fact of a security clearance. And that's what we explored in the book. And the point being, what you need to do, I'd recommend it, you need to look at the regs that actually say what got you a security clearance and not a security clearance. And what was looked at in terms of the kind of security clearance that Oswald was getting was Oswald, did he have a criminal record? No. Did he have a morality record? You had a morality record. If you were homosexual, in all honesty, that was top of the list because that meant that you could be subverted. Did you have a record of sexual indiscretions? Anything that made you a legitimate intelligence target where someone could get leverage on you, you're not going to get a clearance. It wasn't just on behavior and what you were reading. Quite frankly, it was still America then. You could read whatever you wanted to read. And there were people ordering literature from the Soviet Union for reading purposes and getting put on the HT lingual list. Okay, that's what you got. You didn't get kicked out of the Marines. You got on a list to be observed. That's what you got. So their point was twofold. If you did a cross-check against what normally would not get you a security clearance, he's not on the list. He doesn't meet those criteria. So he's going to get the reason he never got a full clearance in Japan was because of his incident, or like throwing a drink on his NCOIC of his unit. That gets you like, okay, wait a minute, maybe he really does have a personality problem. That gets you not a clearance. Will you be allowed to work? Yeah, under a temporary, because they don't have enough radar operators. When you get back to, he was allowed to work twice because they needed radar operators, never got his clearance. But it wasn't because of his political beliefs, most likely. If it happened, it would have been because he wasn't a reliable Marine. You know, that's a different issue than a security clearance. So I know I'm kind of going off on that, but I kind of wish people would pay more attention to sources within the Corps or within the actual regulations rather than speculating from what you would think would be the case.
To be fair, he does cite other examples of military that were hauled over the coals because they had socialist leadings.
Yeah. That depends on when and where you are. And one of the things we know from Oswald's record is the officers that were in charge of him spoke favorably of him. They admired his ability to talk geopolitics. You've got an officer in charge of him that says he can talk geopolitics as well as I can. And this guy's a Georgetown graduate in international relations. So they weren't necessarily put off by, I think you're making the fact that
to sum up,
in barracks.
So to sum that up, Larry, so either they don't take him seriously and they see him as a bit of a joke and a maverick, or they're quite intrigued by him and they want to debate him. Is that kind of your overriding view?
And I think the first part of that is more like it. They see him as a maverick, and that's what the Marines told me. They saw him as a maverick. They almost didn't take him seriously enough. He's not going to stay in the Corps, you know. And he's not saying anything seditious. He's not advocating violence. He's not trying to convert anybody. He's a maverick. And we know he'll be leaving. Like his officer said, look, he was such a maverick when he joined up with the football team. He wanted to call the plays. And so I booted him off the team. I mean, that's the way they viewed him.
Well, he's certainly got a very high opinion of himself, I think, if you look at if you look at everything that you've documented, you know, in the book. So it seems to me that, in a way, Oswald's in on the joke. You know, if they consider him to be a bit of a joke and a maverick, they call him Oswaldovich.
Yeah,
and then he wears the label, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He actually has that. You know, so that's essentially your argument, that the whole thing.
And he's not suspicious. I mean, if you would not be saying all of this if you're really a threat. You know,
no, he's not a deep mole Soviet aligned spy, but he's clearly, you know, very, according to your view, he's very left leaning and he's very overt with it. Okay, well, we've dealt with that controversy.
Just a quick question. I don't mind staying on for longer. If we're going to be going on further, I need to tell my wife she should go ahead and eat.
I think we'd probably wrap it up in half an hour. I think.
Okay, let me tell her that.
That will take us to about the 3 hour mark, and I think we all start suffering from fatigue. Johnny,
I'll give her that choice. I'll leave David with you for just a minute.
Okay, all right. I'll ask David this question then. It's again from Johnny, and it's regarding the Bolton Ford incident. And his question is just, how does that fit in with the Oswald puzzle?
Good question. That was the Bolton Ford incident was what, 1961? Somebody used Oswald's name.
Is this the one where, I can't remember, is this the one where he test drove a car, said he was coming into some money, drove crazily? Somebody help me out here. Can you remember, guys?
Wondering if this is the one where there were two incidents in 1961. There was one of them where there was somebody claiming to be Oswald and another person who wanted to buy a bunch of trucks, I think.
Yeah, a bunch of trucks, yes.
Uh,
Yeah, it's one of those. Did somebody just use his name when Oswald was in the Soviet Union? I don't know how to resolve that. Was it just somebody that saw his name in the paper and used it? And, you know, what's the meaning of that, you know?
His name was in the paper, by the way.
Hoover issued the memo that somebody was using Oswald's identity, didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the relevance of that. I just can't see where that fits into everything. Larry, do you see where it's relevant?
Well, okay, and here, okay, it's raw speculation. Okay, and by the way, apologies, I stepped away. My wife and I are just about to celebrate our 55th anniversary.
Well, congrats.
So I figure if she wants to go ahead and eat, she should go ahead and eat. But that's why I went away. Anyway, this is a wild thought. It's kind of like people that had known Oswald before in New Orleans, like David Ferry. Some of those people certainly were aware. They had seen the newspaper story. There was newspaper stories of Oswald in the Soviet Union. You know, that did give some headlines. His name had been surfaced. And I don't consider it, I think Hoover may very well have been right. It's like, would somebody start using this guy's name? And I can almost see it as all right, this guy we knew, let's start using his name as a cover. That'll confuse everybody. It just using the name, because it was a name that was known in circles, especially that had known Lee Oswald earlier.
I think in the Bolton Ford incident, I'm sure I'm just trying to remember, Joseph Moore might have been his name, but he'd retained a receipt from the kind of estimate for the trucks, and Oswald's name was recorded in the top right-hand side of the receipt at the time of the incident, the Bolton Ford incident.
Scott, do you know if it said
Um,
Lee Harvey Oswald or just Oswald? Do you know?
I think it just said Oswald.
Do a lot of Oswalds in New Orleans, so
Yeah, another thing about that incident is I remember reading about a motor company that was geographically very close to that Bolton, and the guy that owned it, his first name was Oswald, and that there was some speculation that that's
Mm.
who this person was, that was trying to order the trucks and that type of thing.
Ah,
Good.
that's
Yeah,
interesting.
I don't
think
know.
that's right,
I
Nancy.
think the last name started with an S, but I can't remember anything more than that.
Yeah, I think that's
I
right.
think
Okay, well,
I think can I just say, Neil, sorry, I think the second New Orleans incident, a similar incident, the guy, it was somebody, an Oswald tried to buy a car, and he saw Oswald on TV after obviously the assassination, and remembered him as being the guy who he had been buying or wanted to buy a car, had went for a coffee with him. So it's not just an isolated incident of Oswald's name being used. If that's what's going on, it
No,
happened numerous times.
that was a Lincoln Mercury dealership, wasn't it? Yeah, Al
yeah,
Bogard.
yeah, that
Yeah.
was the later incident. I got a bit
Yeah.
in Dallas
In 63.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
got a bit
but
confused. Yeah.
but,
Okay.
but this incident happened in '61. There was more than one incident where an Oswald was around looking to buy cars and stuff like that.
Mm. Okay, well, let's just move on from that particular question. And Nancy, can we go back to your David Lifton related question, please?
Okay. So my question was about that David had a theory in the last few years of his life. He had taken all the letters that Lee had written to Robert and to Marguerite once he decided he wanted to repatriate to the US. And he went through them, and he thought that there was a flow of certain words, certain descriptions that indicated to him that they were coded messages within the documents. His contention was that he was trying to find out if he was going to be in trouble when he came back. The dishonorable discharge was really stuck in his craw, okay, and he really wanted that changed, and that's what led a lot of people to think that, well, he must have been sent by the government then, and then he felt like they were turning their back on him by putting that record through as dishonorable after he had served for his term there in the Marines. And so David, I don't know what the final supposition was on that with David. You know, I think all of us suffer from what I call the Lifton paralysis syndrome, which is you don't write an article or you don't publish because you're just always afraid there's going to be a new witness, a new document, a new piece of dot that gets connected that makes what you just wrote and spent 10 years developing completely obsolete, right? So unfortunately, after best evidence, we don't have anything else of real substance to pull back all that research that he did for decades in that. And I don't know where his materials are. I don't know what the outcome of all that's going to be. But I wondered if you ever communicated with him.
I communicated with David on several occasions, but the nature of the communications would be a message from David that said, Larry, I need so-and-so, and I need it immediately because my publisher is getting ready to bring the book out. And so I've got to have it today. It's like, David, okay. So it was pretty much all one way. And obviously, after about the fifth time that happened over the years, it's like, I don't think the book is going to be published today. Anyway, so no, I communicated with David on a number of occasions, but it was kind of all one directional. I never really got any information from him. And after 2 or 3 rounds of that, I kind of gave up trying to communicate. I keep hearing from people that his manuscript and all his research has survived and something is going to happen with it, but that seems just not to have gotten past the rumor stage so far. But unfortunately, no, I can't add anything to that.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. Pete, you've got another question on the spy camera.
Yeah, do we know when he acquired it and where?
I don't.
I don't. All that we learned, I'll share with you, Pete. All that we learned is, he was taking pictures with, something that would match the right frames and the right size. One thing that David and I found was that Oswald was forever taking pictures. There's never a point when he didn't have a camera. I don't know what type it was, but from his earliest time in the Marine, certainly from his earliest times in the Marine on, once he, I would say, David, I'll ask you what you remember for the first photo, but certainly once he got into the Marine Corps, even inside the United States, on his way to Japan, he was taking pictures constantly in Japan, in Russia. He had, it's immense amount of pictures. I was really shocked by how much of a photography buff that he was. David,
Yeah, I mean,
remember the first pictures?
I don't remember the first pictures, but Oswald was a pack rat. He saved all his photos. You could find them, at the Dallas police website. He kept everything. Pretty much everything he did, all his receipts, all his letters, letters sent to him. He considered himself a photographer. I mean, that he said, "What is your, occupation?" He said, "Photographer," and supposedly that's what he put down. Well, according to the FBI, when he went to Mexico City, he said, "What is your occupation?" The FBI document said he's a photographer. Where that came from, I don't know, but that was him. He did a lot of manipulation of photos also, made copies, especially of his, the visa and his passport photos. He had those taken. So
one thing I can offer, and this is just because I'm as old as I am, but I will say people tend to think of Minox as a spy camera. When I was like 9 or 10 years old, at that point in time, circa 59, 60, every comic book that I had, it was common to find a Minox camera listed in there. This is the camera. Yeah, it's a spy camera, but you want your own Minox camera. The other thing I will just offer from personal experience is if you're traveling with a duffel bag and you're going overseas and that's all you get to carry, you want a small camera.
as a kid, I bought one too. The film was really small.
Yeah.
I don't think it was a Minox, but it was a version of it. I had the same camera, really small.
I presume he got it when he was in the Marines. That was just my logic.
It's odd though, isn't it, that it was the FBI reclassified it as a light meter.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
And now, if you want to get into the FBI's classification of evidence, that's a whole nother story. It's like, okay,
also
once the FBI touches it, I mean, if the CE 399 it could happen to any piece of evidence. So no, I'm not there.
Okay, let's not go down that rabbit hole. So I'm going to get back to you in a second, Gary, because I know that we're running up with another sort of 15, 20 minutes to go. But I wanted to ask you about the 22nd, right? And this notion that he thinks he's going to be a hero and going to be flown out to Cuba, probably from Redbird, on the work that you've done on Redbird. So the guy goes back to 1026 Beckley, gets his gun, fair enough, but he doesn't pack anything. There's no toiletries, there's no clothes, there's no shoes. As David was alluding to, he's a magpie. He doesn't bring any mementos with him. There's no reading material for the flight. I mean, this is a very, very poorly planned exit on the 22nd. And yet the argument you make in the book is that, several days up to this point, he may well have been manipulated into thinking that he was going to be a hero and be flown out on that day. So how do you reconcile the lack of kit?
Well, two or three things. First of all, I think that what happened almost immediately after he left the school depository threw whatever plan was in place out of sync. It whatever might have been planned, maybe he planned to go back to his apartment and pack a suitcase, for all I know. But by the time, as Martino said, after 12:30 with Lee Harvey Oswald, nothing went according to the plan. He didn't move like he was supposed to move. He wasn't playing the game that he had been told to play. And he was suspicious. So I guess my thought, Neil, would be it's hard for me to reverse engineer a logical pattern of behavior for him compared with what he did. I don't think
so
anything.
you're effectively falling back on this is crisis management, basically.
Yeah, for Oswald, and some element of panic. Probably he doesn't know. Maybe what he's still been told is in play, and all that. Some Dallas nut could have shot the Kennedy. He won't really know. He knows things are happening that he wasn't briefed on for sure. So I'm not even sure that he, in getting the gun, did he go back and get the gun because he was scared at that point in time? Maybe. Did he get the gun because he was going to need a gun for the hijacking? Maybe. Okay. It was, I will say that if you read the stories of the hijackers of the period, they were all they got on board a plane as a passenger and then just pulled a gun and hijacked the aircraft. There wasn't a organized plan. I would also have to say that from the plotter standpoint, I still believe that the plot was that Oswald would be killed and material planted on him, tying him to Castro and a Cuban attack team, just like the DR guys were telling Mrs. Luce. So that part didn't happen either. But yeah, the other thing is, to some extent, I think Oswald's conflicted. I know people may not like that, but I think even that Thursday night, he was torn. Am I going to stay with what's more important to me? Am I going to stay with my family, or am I going to take this opportunity of these people have offered me? He may have been very conflicted at that point. I can claim to get in a little ways into his head, but certainly not that far.
It's interesting, though, he didn't have any cash on him either, really, of any note. That doesn't.
He's not going to have to. If you end up as a hijacker in communist Cuba, as a freedom fighter, you're not going to need cash. It's not a problem, honestly. You probably go get to meet Fidel, and things are good. I'm not being facetious. I really, that would be what his expectation was. He's not a hero per se, but he's a PR opportunity for the Cubans, and they'll take care of him.
Yeah, better PR opportunity than the Soviets, that's for sure.
So a bit speculative, but when Oswald's at the Texas Theater, he's going from seat to seat looking to meet his contact to take him to Redbird Airport. Again, going back a little bit, with the SAS, the Special Affairs staff was used, specifically Henry Heckscher and Manuel Artemy, used for identification purposes, were dollar bills cut in half. You could see this on, Mary Farrell website. So, one of the characters we believe was involved, Carlos Hernandez, was working for Henry Heckscher in September 18th, as part of the Emerald Commandos that Heckscher was the, case officer for. Were they using this similar identification method, the ripped in half dollar bill? Because reportedly, I'm just reading this one, was that Oswald had ripped in half dollar bills at his apartment, not on him when he was arrested. There was a report of that. So, it's just interesting. Like,
and Oswald having a torn dollar bill is the cheapest guy in the whole universe. I don't see Oswald tearing his money apart where he can't use it.
Right. So, yeah, he wouldn't have torn it. Somebody would have had the other half. Somebody that knew Heckscher and, who had their POA in September 18th of 63 was Carlos Hernandez. So interesting, just speculation, whatever you want into that, so.
Another loose end on that, spycraft perspective is the Cox department store box
Yes,
Mhm.
yes,
that was also found, which would also be a potential identification to someone you needed to meet.
Yep.
exactly.
Okay. Gary, do you want to ask your next question?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I had put in the chat that Lifton used mother, or Lifton said Oswald used the term mother. And of course, he's talking to his mother in some of the letters, but coincidentally, that was Angleton's code name, which is kind of curious. Now, Lifton still believed that, at least in 2013. I just saw
I
an
have a
interview.
hard time seeing James Angleton giving a Lee Harvey Oswald an actual known code name. Gary, tell me this. We know that all the CIA officers had like multiple names, including, they had crypts, they had aliases, and then they had names that they used on their own that weren't even agency names. What my memory is not such. Where does mother, what class is mother in for Angleton? Where's that name show up?
I can't answer that. I just watched the 3-hour memorial lecture that he gave in 2013. And I just happened across it on YouTube yesterday and day before, watched all 3 hours. But he, in 2013, is still going into quite a bit of detail in his lecture about the apparent code words that he's using in those letters. And
Lifton's, yeah, right, yeah.
yeah. So I'm just saying that either Lifton, he had some theories that were kind of off the wall and parlays them into other supposed truths, but at some point he was aware that Angleton was using mother in some fashion. So I don't know.
I've just never come across, David, we know some crypts but anyway, I've just not come, I think I've heard what you just said, but I don't think I've ever seen it, what the source was.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, my only point is really that Lifton was still thinking that 10 years, 20 years after his book, So the other, I put in the chat reference to the backyard photo and the fact that Oswald was actually holding 2 newspapers. And do you think that the fact that they were from opposite ends of the socialist communist spectrum, from pro-Soviet to anti-Soviet in the case of the one paper, that he was signaling that I'm not really a communist, or do you think that he was just confused?
Well, we know he subscribed to both of them, so we know that much. We know he read both of them because he writes about things that were in both of them. I might come in on the confusion factor in terms of, he writes after he returns from Russia, that the Soviets are using Communist Party USA as a tool. It's a tool for them. They're not serious about these foreign communist parties. They'll just use them however they present an opportunity. So he knows that, but he writes to both Socialist Workers Party and Communist Party USA. Oswald appeared to be, he read a lot, but it's like his use of the term, he has Marxist and communist almost synonymous, and he has socialist and Marxist. To him, I think it was maybe just one thing, but all I can say is I've seen that question before. All I can say is he subscribed to both of them, and he was writing to both of them in '63. So I don't know that it would have represented a message per se, since he's associated himself with both.
And
Yeah.
Oswald thought of himself, in all his arrogance, I am the smartest guy in the room, right? Everyone else is child's play. I'm the one that really gets it. And, even Michael Payne said, he told me he gets his kind of orders from the party through those publications because you need to read between the lines, right? And he's like, show me, he was a Rex Bradford. Prove it to me. What are you talking about? and there was no pursuit of that, in any further than that. But it kind of ties in with all of this too.
That does remind me of Oswald. I mean, to understand Oswald writes a monograph, right? That essentially says this is the solution of how you integrate capitalism and Marxism, and all you've got to do is bring them this, and you've got the solution. You've got to be pretty self-confident to write that sort of stuff.
Let's just think about the possibility that Oswald's head was on somebody's body, and who's the person that says that the cop
Roscoe White.
Roscoe
White, yeah.
So let's think that Roscoe White doesn't know the difference between the two newspapers. So he just figures we'll do a double indictment of Oswald, and this way we can't miss. He's got to be a communist.
Yeah.
He's reading both newspapers.
Do you think, following that, Gary, do you think that when he was being interrogated at the DPD then, when he was shown that photo, that he would have noticed those two contrasting magazines and might have made some comment to the police about that that's never been accurately recorded? Just speculation, just your
good
thoughts.
Idea. You'd think he would have. I just don't know. Maybe somebody from DPUK, Bart Camp, might know it.
They would have known that he was a subscriber to both, so it's not like he could deny knowing about them, right? So that's it's one of those things. Nice to know. I don't know that it solves the case for us, but as many things, there's so many rabbit holes.
Right.
Just from speaking for Oswald or about Oswald, again, I don't claim to be. One thing we do know about, in the fact, aside from the fact that he was a bit of a drama queen, is Oswald would lie. I don't want to ever present, especially when Oswald got his back to the wall. When Oswald first came back to the U.S. and was interviewed by the FBI, he told multiple lies about what he had or had not said inside the Soviet Union. And they caught him on it. It's kind of like, no, you did say that, and Oswald just stonewall goes ahead and lies about it. He even lied on his job applications. How much nerve do you have to have when you're in New Orleans and you've gone to the FBI about Heidel and you fill out a job application and use Heidel as a reference?
Larry, that
was a nervy character.
That was going to be one of my last final questions, actually. Do you think that he was a classic narcissist? Because it seems that the classic symptoms, if you like, is that the world revolves around you. You are an effortless liar and you are a manipulator. And it seems to me that there are certain of those traits one could assigned to his character, but you never mention that in the book. I did hear a podcast not so long ago, I think it was on one of Rob Clark's shows, where he played a presentation from one of the Dallas conferences from a psychologist who was making a very strong claim that he was a classic narcissist. Do you have an opinion on that at all?
I think I would lean in the direction, it's kind of like Nancy just said. Oswald thought he was smarter than everybody else. I don't know that translates to narcissism. He really felt from that he was outside the system. He could objectively have a better view of things, that he was willing to go see everything for himself. He trusted his own opinions. Now, how close does that get you to narcissism? To me, I've always thought that a narcissist would be kind of proudly proclaiming, saying, like in public, I'm smarter than everybody, it's just all about me. that doesn't,
He certainly wasn't taking any credit for the assassination, that's for sure.
yeah, it doesn't strictly strike me. I'd be interested in what Nancy has said. It doesn't strike me. He's ego driven. There's no doubt about that. But it's sort of like, if you don't believe what I say, that just shows that you're stupid. It doesn't show that I'm special. You know, it's like you're just not, you can't see what I see. I don't know that that's narcissism.
I think he has some narcissistic tendencies. Even when, again, going back to Ernesto Rodriguez, when he met with him in New Orleans, he tried to impress him how smart he was and how well read he was. And Ernesto actually said, well, he is smart, but he's trying to prove that to everybody he meets, just how smart he is. You know, I'm smarter than you. I read all the time. I go to the library, you know, and I've read all these books, and I am just smarter than you, you know, so. And
it is interesting, David, that you do make a strong case of how intelligent and smart he is, but he probably felt very unsmart at around about 12:30
yes,
on the 22nd of November, because he had, you know, according to your narrative, you know, he'd been had.
Maybe not at 12:30, but at least by 12:45 when he heard the broadcast about, by that time it's like, oops.
Absolutely.
As Larry brought up, Oswald could be conned if you agree with him. You could string him along to say, yeah, I believe this. Yeah. And he says, all right, you know, I'll go along with you. You know, he could be conned.
Yeah.
That's a really important part, is that he, in one way, you might consider him a manipulator, but the other way, he's a perfect target for a con. If you agree with him and you seem to believe what he says, you can be his best friend, you know.
I agree with that, Larry. I think you can be very intelligent and a poor judge of character. So that is feasible. Look, I want to wrap this up. Just two more questions. The last one is going to be just knocking around with the white Russian community. How does that square with the left-leaning? I mean, you could argue that he was a la the anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans, that he's intrigued. He wants to have debate. You know, he wants to prove how smart he is. But in theory, given the ideological side of him, he really wouldn't particularly want anything to do with those type of people. So, I mean, you could argue also that maybe he was going along with Marina because she was interested and it was part of the new community that they were developing relationships with. But just how do you just square that one?
I think that's a great question, and I think it reveals a lot. I mean, he was introduced to that community by he had gone to this fellow who was a Russian language, you know, actually taught Russian at some libraries in Fort Worth, and that's where he got his name. He went to him because he wanted certification that he was competent to be a Russian translator, which the guy did. He gave him a letter. It was that fellow who introduced him to some other Russian speakers. At that point, they're Russian speakers. Okay, Lee likes speaking Russian. He wants Marina to speak Russian. So we'll go, and who else? It's the white Russian community, right? Now, after the white Russian community has been exposed to Lee for about 2 months, they don't like Lee, and Lee doesn't like them. And that's one of the things we detail in the book, is that they adopt Marina, and that really irritates Lee. They are giving her things that irritates him, and he doesn't like their politics. He does not hang around with them. As a matter of fact, after the very beginning, the Mohrenschildt gets him invited to a couple of parties where they are, and he doesn't talk to them. So I guess my response is, he didn't like the White Russians. The White Russians were empathetic towards Marina. They actually kept, on a number of occasions, tried to separate the couple. One of the White Russians told Marina that if she would he'd help her get the legal support to divorce Lee, and they would support her inside the community. So, yeah, I see that almost as proving the opposite point. No, he does not. He might hang out a little bit, but he doesn't really like these people.
I think that's a very reasonable explanation, actually. All right. Well, look, final question. Right. What has been the response and the feedback from, I don't know, Malcolm Blunt, Bill Simpich, Jeff Morley, John Newman, because these are the guys that are very much into, you know, a certain aspect of this saga. How's their feedback been so far?
Well, Rex obviously is pretty positive, or he would not have gotten out of the gate. Bill has been very supportive. He's done reviews for us. So Simpich is, which he should, because we quote him so much. I mean,
Well, you quote him, you
he's
quote
a major
Jeff
source.
Morley,
Same for Morley.
you quote Malcolm Blunt and Alan Dale.
Morley gave us a positive review, took us on his show for like 2 hours, and we had a great session with Jeff. I haven't really heard anything from Malcolm. Alan gave us, Dale, who kind of represents John a lot of times, gave us a very positive review and put something on a ARC for us. Have not heard from John at all, and don't routinely talk to John, so that's like no surprise. And you know, considering everything, that's no surprise. But I guess there hasn't been that much. There have been questions, kind of like you're asking questions today, where people want to know where we stand or why we thought, but I haven't really seen, aside from the 3-part review that Johnny is writing, there haven't, you know, one lady before the book was even on sale posted on Amazon that I was a nut, but I didn't take that too seriously. David,
but you're not alone. You're not alone, nut. You come as a
that's true, just a nut, generic. David?
My opinion, Larry is a nut, you know, so
yeah,
no question about that. So far, yeah, we expect it to be controversial because it goes against a lot of the sacred cows that people hold, you know, so it's tough to break through some of the ingrained ideas that have been around for 30 years when we try and bring out new documentation and present a new view. So we expect that, you know, it's not unexpected. As far as like one of the big Mexico City issues, I think the whole research committee is probably split 50-50 on whether Oswald was there or not. So that's expected, you know. Again, Mexico City's a conundrum, you know. Was he impersonated? Yes, he was probably impersonated, you know, for the Soviet embassy, that whole the phone call that everybody, you know, holds up like poor Russian, good Spanish. You know, what that was a pretext call that the FBI and CIA uses, like, I'm pretending to be somebody to find out some information. I mean, we have good documents where, you know, the CIA calls the Soviet embassy and to find out information, and they pretend to be somebody else. You know, we have good documentation on that, but I'll leave it at that. So, Larry?
So generally speaking, I think the reaction has been they either don't consider it worth engaging with because it's just wrong, or there's not much discussion. If you start a discussion on the Ed Forum on it, it just starts going into all sorts of tangents. So it's really been, I think it's like either engage with it and have your own thoughts, or just don't even engage with it.
Well, I think I was going to wrap it up now and mention the fact that Nancy had just said what a terrific meeting it has been today, and I think it has been really constructive. But I see Nancy's put her hand up, so I don't know whether you've got another question, have you?
I always have another question. You know that. If I see Joe is still on the call, if he can just talk a few minutes about the latest release and his plea for people to write to NARA, I think that'd be really helpful for this group.
Yeah, good point. I was supposed to come to Joe. Joe,
If you don't mind, we'll probably leave you all, or at least I will.
I want to listen to Joe.
Okay.
I
have to respect my wife again.
Just before you go, Larry, David, have you been pouring through this stuff in the last 3 days?
Yeah,
have you found anything that confirms or repudiates what you've said so far?
The things that I found tend to support the fact that at least one part of the CIA, Gary, I'm not going to say all parts, I'm not going to say James Angleton, were very confused about Oswald being in Russia, that they weren't sponsoring him and that they weren't on a mission. They didn't understand his going and they didn't understand his coming. So that was interesting to me. Other than that, I'm very involved because, and it's been announced, so you all might want to know this. we have been providing information to Jeff Morley for use in channeling it into the releases and into Congressman Luna's hearings,
Right.
which she is going to start next week, which we think are very important because she is in a position to call for collections, not just releasing already released documents, but actually go collect other stuff we need, like films. And so, yeah, I've been very involved in talking with Jeff into what documents we should have listed, should be collected, that we know exist, that were never provided, what materials, etc. So the one thing I will say, and for those people who are following it, this afternoon I plan to post an extended article on my WordPress blog about Garrett Underhill. And I think the explanation for his remark, which we actually understand now, I first wrote about it back in 2006, but I think we understand what had him scared. And I'm going to understand why he was scared and why he probably didn't need to be, but he wouldn't have known that, because what he thought was an illegal operation with rogue CIA officers led by Henry Heckscher was actually a sanctioned operation. But that's a long story. So that's the one document I do plan to respond to.
Yeah, Brooks has just made another great point. We need the tax returns.
Well, all I can say is one thing I've learned about the agency: if you really are deep and operational, they don't give you your money to list on your tax return. If you're a CIA officer, right, they will give you your money for a tax return. But I'd love to see them, but I'm still thinking, if that were true, the only thing we're going to see is
actually has separate filing documents for agents, okay, and informants, etc. So that's why that's why I'm so interested in the DeMorenshield ones, because the official document on which he would have filed his return each April 15th is not the same as the surreptitious one that is filed with the IRS. I mean, it's to the point where they would send you the information and say, here's what you need to report on your tax return, your special tax return. Okay. And you better make sure that it jives, so that we're all in sync about what we're having you do and what you're not doing, et cetera, and that. So that's another aspect of those tax returns. It is not just the official 1040. It's these other surreptitious ones that we need to get our hands on.
Well, if I really wanted to see anything, it would be the reports that J. Walton Moore filed within Domestic Ops on his meeting with DeMorenshield and what it was being reported back on. Those are what I want to see, and which nobody ever gave us. And those are actually known documents that had to have existed, because you don't tell the guy to go meet unless you expect to make a report on what he says.
Right.
So I'm with you, Nancy, but I'll shut up.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Really appreciate that, Larry. If you've got to drop off now.
It was nice being with you all again.
55 years. Incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
It's been a lot, and just think, 30 some years of that have been with me obsessed over JFK. Think of how much that elevates the problem or challenge.
Yeah, but I can beat you because I'm married to a lone nutter.
Oh dear.
No.
Yes.
Oh, that's it. Okay. Kudos to you. Yeah.
Is that Nancy? Is that why you're coming over here with your sister and not your husband?
You got it.
All right. Well, cheers, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Joe, have you got a couple of minutes just to go through this stuff?
Just real simple, just to call NARA and the task force, and just to get NARA to release an Excel listing of what they're releasing and when, with the RIF numbers, but just to get an Excel listing so that we know what was released when. And NARA must have that information. It's not that they have to do any extra hard work or anything, but I'm sure they have an Excel thing, rather than put it all in one big dump in one big file in one web page, so that we can keep track of what's being released.
Have you been meticulously poring over this stuff the last 3 days?
Not so much, but I have created a listing of what was the first batch and the second and the third.
Right.
And I put that in the chat at the beginning. It's I put it on my Substack.
Okay, thank you. Has anything come out from the DPD at all? Was it just FBI and CIA stuff?
A mixture of stuff from CIA, FBI, the presidential libraries, the JFK, LBJ, the Ford
Yeah.
Library, because that was the church committee stuff. Some other stuff. One was RIF was 135. I forget what agency that is now off the top of my head. But in 206, which is the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and the review board was the first guys to get that stuff declassified. So it's a mix of stuff.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, look, thank you for that, Joe. All right, guys. I thought that was a really interesting discussion. Thank you for your attendance. And we'll see you in a couple of months, probably.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much,
Great.
everyone.
Bye, guys.
Thank
now.
you.
Take care.
Bye,
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Neil.